Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the New York Fed's 2023 Culture Conference. My name's James Hennessy. I lead the New York Fed's Governance and Culture Reform Initiative, and I'll be your MC today. Now, like many organizations over the past few years, we shifted to programming online in 2020. And while there are some real advantages to programming virtually, there's really something magical that happens when you get people live together, as you all here are today at the bank. So we're particularly delighted to see you here and hope it was worth getting through security. Through the Culture Initiative, we aim to educate, inform, and learn, along with the financial industry, about how to reduce instances of misconduct, promote healthier cultures within firms and across the industry, and to increase public trust. Our speakers today are some of the foremost experts in their fields, a behavioral economist known for his work on decision-making, researchers and academics who study what motivates and incentivizes human behavior, and leaders in the healthcare and nuclear sectors who are going to share how they have created learning cultures by confronting mistakes head-on. We'll also hear from the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who's developed new policies and practices to promote greater accountability within firms and by individuals. So we're looking forward to a very wide range of viewpoints advancing our collective dialogue together. Our final speakers of the day are New York Fed President John Williams and Vice Chair for Supervision at the Federal Reserve Board, Michael Barr. They will be in discussion moderated by Gillian Tett of the Financial Times, and they'll share their thoughts on why culture matters, why and what new challenges in particular they see on the horizon. Before we get started, I've got a few logistics to go through. We'll take one break, probably around 10:05 for about 15 or 20 minutes, again, just outside here of the auditorium. And I encourage you all to use the two doors here on either side to exit the auditorium. At 12:30, when the conference concludes, you're invited to join us for a buffet luncheon in the Liberty Room downstairs on the first floor of the bank, and we very much hope you'll attend so that we can all continue the conversation there. If you need any assistance throughout the day, please ask any of our staff members. They're identified by the green ribbons on their badges. And if you need a Wi-Fi connection, please proceed to the lobby at the top of these stairs, and there'll be somebody there to help you. We've made all the conference materials, including the full speaker bios and the attendee list, available via the QR code that's right behind me and on your printed program. We're taking a couple of quick polls today, as you might have already noticed. The first poll and your anonymous responses, I hope, will be displayed on the screen behind me. And in the second question will be displayed during the break. We're recording today's event, and we'll make videos available a week or two now on the New York Fed's website. Today's conference is also open to press and on the record. If you would like to tweet, we ask that you use #BankingCulture. Finally, please make sure that all your devices are turned to silent. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dan Ariely. Dan is a co-founder of Irrational Capital and a leading behavioral economist, author, entrepreneur, and the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University. He's also a founding member of the Center for Advanced Hindsight. Thank you for joining us today, Dan.
The thing about the Center for Advanced Hindsight is usually a test of the degree of humor in the audience. You didn't do so well. Okay, good morning. Pleasure to be here. I thought before I'll start, I'll say something about half beards. You might have noticed that I have half a beard, and you might have wondered why. So this half a beard has a few reasons. The first one was that I was badly burned many years ago. Most of my body is covered with scars, including the right side of my face, so I just don't have hair growing on this side. But for many years I shaved. And when I shaved, I looked less non-symmetrical. And then about a few years ago, I went on a month-long hike, and at the end of that hike, I looked sort of like this with slightly less white. And when I looked at myself in the mirror the first time with this half a beard, I didn't like how I looked. But I thought I'll keep the half a beard for a few weeks just for the memory of the hike. So I kept it around, and I posted a few things on all kinds of things on social media. And to my surprise, I got a few notes from people who thanked me for the half a beard. Why did they thank me for the half a beard? These were people who were struggling with their own injuries. They were feeling that in their daily life they were trying to hide something, and they said that me so openly not caring gave them a little bit of strength. I, of course, didn't tell them that it was by accident. I didn't intend to do it, but as I got these messages, I felt, okay, if this half a beard gives some people a bit more guts to hide a little bit less, maybe I'll keep it for a while longer as a public service announcement. So I kept the half a beard. But the surprising thing happened about 4 months later. And about 4 months later, I felt that I feel differently about my own scars. I have lots of scars in lots of places, lots of deformities. And I felt that my relationship with my scars have changed, that I look at them less as scars and more as like the journey of my life. I still have pain. I mean, all kinds of things are happening. There's still things that are difficult to do. But some of the emotional complexity of the scars have changed. And I started wondering why. And here is my thought about this. Think about people who shave. If you're not injured and you go to shave, you shave. You have stubble in the morning, a few minutes later you don't have stubble. If you're like me, you start the day with no stubble on one side and stubble on the other side, and then by the end of the process you feel less non-symmetrical. In fact, shaving, in my case, was not just shaving, it was also hiding a lack of symmetry. I was more non-symmetrical before shaving, less non-symmetrical after that, and I started thinking about what is the process of shaving day in and day out for many years. What is the process of hiding does to a person? And I think it does not so good things, right? And basically, stopping this shaving was actually very helpful for me in all kinds of ways. Last thought. I'm a social scientist. I'm supposed to understand human nature. And if you asked me, is it good not to shave? I would have said no. Right? I would have been really good in predicting day one with half a beard. Day one is not fun. People point, ask questions, kids laugh, all kinds of things happen. I wouldn't have anything within my set of intuition that could have told me what would happen 4 months later. And I think that's true for lots of human behaviors. I think lots of things we can predict day one. What would happen if we change something in our culture tomorrow? What would happen if we change prices? We could change all kinds of things about the immediate effect. Understanding long-term processes is something that we really don't have good intuition about what will happen. And I think that's the role of social science, is to give us some of those, it's not intuition, but some of those findings to anchor our decisions about. I think working from home, working from the office, these are things of that nature. If you ask me after 3 years of working at home, what would day one look like in the office? I can tell you. Oh, I got used to my own chair and my own coffee and so on. But if you ask me how would year 2 look like, we don't have intuitions about that. Okay, enough about facial hair. Let's talk about human motivation and culture. So in my research life on human motivation, there were 3 chapters. Chapter 1 was lab. I brought people to the lab and I did all kinds of experiments with them. I'll tell you about one of those. Then I would go to companies and work with them and do one experiment at a time. And then the last stage, which started about 6 years ago, we looked at companies more general and the influence between human capital and stock market return. I'll tell you about all of those three. So step number one, imagine the following experiment. You come to a lab, and I say, look, I have these sheets of paper with lots and lots of random letters, and on each sheet, there are 12 pairs of letters that are identical. And your task is to find those 12 pairs and circle them. And you'll get more money for the first sheet and next for the next, less for the next, less, until you decide, I had enough time to go home, pay me for all the sheets of paper. And every time I'll give you one sheet, you'll work on it, you'll come to me, and then I'll give you another one, and so on. And we had three conditions. The first one, which we call acknowledged. You finish marking your sheet, you come to me, I look at the sheet, I scan it from top to bottom, I say, and I put it on the pile. Do you want to do another one for a few cents less? If you want to do another one, here it is, get back, and we continue until you said, enough, time to go home. Condition number two, start the same thing, here's a sheet of paper, you bring it to me, I don't look at it, I don't say, I simply put it on the pile. Would you like to do another one for a few cents less? This is, we call the ignore condition. So the first one had the second one is ignore. The third condition, you do the same thing, you work, you bring me the sheet of paper, I take it and I put it directly through a shredder. Would you like to do another one for a few cents less? You go this, come back, another shredder. By the way, it was a student who worked on Wall Street that gave me the idea for this experiment. His boss did not shred his work, but he felt shredded. How much do you think people worked in the three conditions? So obviously, we all think that people worked much more in the acknowledge condition. We think that people worked much less in the shredder condition. But when we asked people, MBA students at Stanford, to predict, they thought the effect would be small. In fact, the effect is quite big. Seeing your work destroy in front of your eyes, we can sit here and speculate. The moment you see it, it's very painful, and people stop. So people worked much more for the acknowledge condition, much less for the shredder. Where do you think was the ignored condition? Close to the acknowledge, close to the shredder, in the middle, what do you think? Maybe do like this. Do like this if you think it's like the acknowledged, this if it's in the middle, do this if it's like the shredder. Okay, very good. So most of you predict correctly that it's closer to the shredder. What are some of the conclusions we can come up with this, or the hypothesis? The first one is if you really want to demotivate the people who work for you, go with the shredder. Like there's no substitute for a shredder. But the other thing is that simply not acknowledging people is close to the shredder. Simply not acknowledging people is close to the shredder. And I'm not going to ask you to do it out loud, but how often is it the case that you don't acknowledge people sufficiently? Think about your home life, think about your professional life, how often? The positive side is that simply looking at people and saying makes a big deal. Now, I'm not saying that saying is the achievement of human acknowledgement. We can go better than that, but even that level of acknowledgement seems to be effective. And we certainly don't do it enough, right? Sometimes it feels that people feel as if we were born with a fixed amount of compliments that we can give, and if we give all of them, life will be over. No, the reality is we can give lots of compliments. It's okay. Life will continue. Sometimes people ask, don't people feel like they give too much compliments? Never met that case. Don't worry. Okay, so that was kind of the stuff we were doing in the lab. We're paying with taxes and compliments and favors and all kinds of things like that. Then we moved to experiments with one company at a time. One company at a time. I'll describe one experiment. This was in Intel, the chip manufacturer. And in that particular production facility, people worked for 4 days on, 4 days off. 4 days on, 4 days off. On the days that they worked, they had 12-hour shifts, long days, 4 days off, back to work. And the people at Intel were concerned that after 4 days off, people come back to work not fully excited to work. So they said on that first day of the work cycle, let's give them a target, let's say 1,300 computer chips, and let's give them a bonus, $30. So 4 days off, back, target. You leaving already? We just started? It's okay, it's okay. So first day, goal, $30. Day 2, no goal, no bonus, no goal, no bonus, no goal, no bonus. 4 days off, back, goal, and bonus. That's a very interesting system because it's a system that has bonuses some days and not on other days. And it allows you to understand the carryover effect from how does a bonus day influence the non-bonus days. Right? How do the bonuses work and how they influence the non-bonus days. So I asked them if we could do a control condition. What will be a control condition? Nothing. They said yes. So I pushed my luck. I said, look, we have a lot of research showing that gifts are very different than money. Right? For example, people end up doing much more for a cappuccino than they would do for $3.50. You know? He said, we have this, a lot of data on gifts. Gifts are special. Can we do gifts? So they said, what do you want to do? I said, I want on that day, when people reach their goal, that we will send them pizza at home. This way, people would be heroes in the eyes of their family. They will get something tangible. You know, it's lots of back and forth, lots of back and forth. It turns out Intel can make unbelievably good computer chips. Pizza at home is too much. That's too complex. So lots of debate. Eventually, we agreed on voucher for pizza. It's not pizza, but you know, it's something. Okay. And then I said, okay, but voucher for pizza is not gifty enough. I want more gift. They said, okay, as long as it doesn't cost money. I said, okay, how about a compliment? They said, okay, as long as the boss doesn't have to meet the employee face to face. Okay, so we had 4 groups. Group 1 gets back, told nothing. Group 2 gets back. If you reach 1,300 computer chips, you'll get $30. Group 3, if you reach 1,300 computer chips, you'll get a voucher for pizza. Group 4, if you reach 1,300 computer chips, you'll get a nice text message from the boss saying, work well done. And now the first question is, on that day, which group did the best? And you can guess, but the reality is they basically did the same. The control condition did the worst. The money condition did about 6% better. And the pizza and compliment did about 1% better. It's a small effect on that day. So first, all incentives work, but they all work in a very similar way. But remember, the reason for this was to understand the carryover effect. What happened on the next day? What do you think happened on the money condition? The money condition went up by about 6 days, about 6%, went down by about 12% the next day. Right? It was as if people said, yesterday you paid me, I was interested. Today you're not paying me, I'm losing my motivation. We call this crowding out. Right? And the reality is that there are many cases in which you add financial motivation and actually take away motivation. Imagine I asked you to help me change the tire on my car. How likely would you be to help? Don't say it out loud. What if I asked you, if I offered you $3? How would you think about it? Would you say, gee, I get to help another human being plus I get $3? Or you would say, I don't work for $3. Right? The moment we add money in, something about the social motivation changes. This is some of the challenges with things like No Child Left Behind and other payment programs that eventually decreased motivation. So we said that money went up just like the other one, went down, slowly recovered throughout the week. In total, Intel lost about 5% of productivity by paying a $30 bonus, right? Really big deal in the production facility. What happened with the compliment? The compliment went up and slowly went down over the week, but always stayed above the control condition. And the voucher for the pizza was kind of in between. And I suspect that if the pizza was real with crust and smell and so on, it might have been better than the compliment, or at least as good. And if it was more contractual, good only for Tuesday, not for black olives, it would have been worse. So we had lab experiments, we had field experiments of this nature, we had lots of them. And about 6 years ago, one of my friends asked me whether we could look at companies across the US economy and estimate how good they are in treating their employees. So this is not an experiment. We can't go to all the companies and improve. This is just, can we measure? Can we measure? And of course, and would that measurement predict stock market success? So I thought, of course. I said, I don't know if we can have good data, but if we could have good data, I have no question in my mind that we could link it to alpha. Why? Because every company is a machine that runs on people, right? And if the people are happy and motivated and so on, there's a good chance the productivity will be high, and if people are miserable, it will be low. Every CEO says that on every meeting. My people are the best thing I have, only that it's not clear that they do it, that they act on it. By the way, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. First of all, they're not experts in human motivation. It's very hard for companies to do experiments. Right? Think about if you want to try for yourself one day to eat chicken and one day to eat fish, you can do it. If a company wants to change their policy from fish to chicken, there's lots of lawyers and committees and things are involved. Because of labor laws, you can't do this bonus to half the people and that bonus to half the people. So the reality is that companies are incredibly restricted in their ability to learn about human motivation. That's one reason. There's a few more. So anyway, we went on a journey to collect good data. And we were very lucky to find lots of data, and over the years we got even more data. But I'll describe to you just kind of our first data set. So our first data set was built on these satisfaction surveys. You must have all gotten them at some point, right? You get a list of questions, you answer 1 to 7 on lots and lots of things. And we got those surveys for lots of companies and lots of people within a company. And we got this data going back to 2006. So imagine that you have this data set, about 1,000 companies, over 1,000 people per company from 2006 until COVID. I'll tell you about COVID in a minute. And we started with something very simple. We said, imagine that those surveys did not have 70, 80 questions. Imagine they had one question, one at a time. So let's imagine that there was a question about coffee quality. And imagine that we took the companies in 2006 and we sorted them from the company who had the highest quality coffee to the company who had the lowest quality of coffee. And we pretended that we bought in the prices of 2006 the 20% companies had the best coffee quality in the eyes of their employees. And we carry that portfolio. And these surveys are happening once a year. So in 2007, we got new data. And maybe one company went up and one company went down. So now we have 20%, differently constructed, but still 20%. And we carry that portfolio from 2006 until COVID of the 20% companies who treat their employees best on quality of coffee, on salary, health benefits, chair, tables, every one of the questions, one by one. Now, of course, nobody would build an investment portfolio like this, but this is just to understand how are the building blocks? How are the building blocks of that? So from those 70-some portfolios, how many of them from 2006 until COVID do you think were just as good or better than the S&P? Remember, these are portfolios that were constructed by a question that somebody thought about, not designed for this purpose. And these portfolios have no financial data in them. They're just how do you feel about chairs, quality of coffee, salary, and so on. How many of them do you think beat the S&P, or just as good, or beat the S&P? Okay, basically, almost all of them. Almost all of them. And by the way, what do you think if we bought the bottom 20%? Almost all of them underperformed. So as a social scientist, I said, oh my goodness, it's really easy to beat the S&P. I don't know what these people do with financial data and so on. Just ask people how they feel in the company. But of course, some of those portfolios were just like the S&P, and some were much better. And the question is, which questions have a real alpha signal and which questions don't? So for example, do you think that salaries are a big predictor or not? Say like this if you think it's a big predictor, like this if it's not. Okay, it's not. Health benefits, big, no. Retirement benefits, no. Chairs, tables, stuff like that, no. It turns out that everything about extrinsic motivation doesn't matter that much. In general, we have these two buckets, extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is salary, bonuses, health benefits, retirement benefit, and so on. Those things, we don't find evidence that they have a serious impact on alpha. I'm not saying stop them, but I'm just saying we don't find this. On the other hand, on the intrinsic motivation, we find lots of alpha. So for example, I told you that salary doesn't matter. Perception of fairness of salary matters a lot. Perception of fairness of promotion matters a lot. Feeling appreciated, by the way, think about our Shredder experiment. Number one predictor, do you feel appreciated in the company? Psychological safety ends up being important. And bureaucratic burden is the number one way to destroy motivation. If you want, it's like the equivalent of the shredder. Because when we increase bureaucracy, we tell people we don't trust you, we don't respect your time, and we don't want you to try anything new. Anyway, within this bucket of intrinsic motivation, we further break it into two components. One of them we call goodwill. What's goodwill? Think to yourself about your current performance at work and imagine that we called it 100. Your current performance at work is 100. How much down you can push it and still not get fired? Don't say it out loud, I'm not going to ask. Just think about how much down you can push it and not get fired. And now think about how much up space do you have up to increase it if you really cared about what you were doing. And I hope you recognize that there's a big gap. There's a big gap between, and that's goodwill. That's the question of how truly energized people are. And companies really want people who are truly excited, right? To get people who are just barely doing things not to get fired is not a good investment in human capital. So that's the first component. The second component, we need a better name. We call utility embracing. What's the idea here? Imagine a janitor. The janitor have a very specific job description of what they need to do. One day, they walk in the corridors and they see a family lost. Should they help them? Of course. One day, they hear a patient crying. Should they call somebody? Of course. The reality is that in many cases, we want people not to do their job description. We give people job description, but what we really want people to do is to stand up, look around and say, where else can I be helpful for the organization? And when people just do their job description, we don't get that. But we do need this expansion. We call it utility embracing because we want people to take the utility function of the organization and say, what is the organization? Even though it will cost me more. The janitor then later had to do their job, right? They're going an extra effort. Anyway, if we think about those components, it has a real impact. And we can show that it has a real impact over the S&P. If you create an investment portfolio, I can show you some slides. I'll just show you one, but oops, that was the one I wanted to show. But if you look at the Russell 1000 and you look at portfolios that are built on organizational alignment or innovation or intrinsic motivation, you get a much higher performance. And by the way, in some sense, it's kind of obvious. One of our partners in this is saying that human capital is an accounting mistake. If a company invests in a warehouse, it's an investment. If a company invests in people, it's a cost. Why don't we ask companies to capitalize, to put on their balance sheet human capital? I mean, nobody would say, oh, it's a bad idea. It's just that it's difficult to do it, so we don't do it. So because of that, it has excess returns. But the reality is that human capital should be on the balance sheet, and companies should be encouraged to invest in human capital in the same way that we ask them to do other investments. 2 other points. There's an index in the US called the SHE index, and I don't intend to poo-poo on that particular index, but just to give you an example. The SHE index counts how many women are in the board and how many women are in the top management, and they invest in the organization that have the highest percentage of women at the top management and at the board level. And how well do you think that index does financially? Much better than the S&P, slightly better, the same, slightly worse, or much worse? Yeah, that's a politically complex, I know it's a political correctness question. It's a not so good index financially, to say the least. And the question is why? Is it not a good idea to treat women fairly? Of course not. It's a fantastic idea to treat women fairly. It's just that the SHE index is approaching measurement without thinking about the psychology. Is having a high percentage of women an indication that we treat them fairly? No. You can have professions like nursing and teaching that most of the people are women and we treat all of them terribly, right? Simply, numbers are not an indication of being treated well. And even if we did treat well the women at the top of the organization, does it mean that all women throughout the organization feel like they're treated equally? No. We have taken our data. How do you feel about salary? How do you feel about tables, coffee, and so on? And we created for each company, instead of 1 measurement, 2 measurements. How do men answer and how do women answer? And we say, let's sort the companies by the companies that have lower delta to the companies that have higher delta, and invest only in the companies that are treating women equally. Turns out it's a fantastic index. But the index has to be based on a real psychology. Sometimes I think that these measures that we're measuring, I know they're not intuitive to people in the financial sector. People in the financial sector want hard measurement. Give me the number of women. I know it's a harder measurement than to ask women, how do you feel? But the reality is that what we really want is, do you feel that you're being treated fairly? If you think about pain, we don't have a good neural measure about pain. At the end of the day, we have to ask the person, how do you feel? How do you feel about that pain? And it's influenced by lots of things, and what we need to do is to get the subjective feeling. The same thing is true about human motivation. We have to understand how that person is feeling, and even though it's not the ideal measurement, it's important. Last question. Did the role of intrinsic motivation went up, stayed the same, or went down during COVID? It went up. Why did it went up? Think about the kid in 7th grade. When the kid is in school, the teacher can say, sit straight, don't talk to Johnny, put your phone down. The kid is at home with Zoom, they can just turn the teacher off. Now, we are not exactly kids, but we're not exactly different. How many of you during COVID have pretended that something was wrong with your video and you turned off a Zoom call? The reality is that the work environment does have things that help us control ourselves and get us to focus and work more. When we're home, it's a little different. And I think that at the extent to which work at home is here to stay, the importance of understanding intrinsic motivation is going to be higher, and the companies who do it better are going to be doing well. I think we need to pay more attention to human capital. I think companies should start accounting it. I think organizations should start paying attention. I think that right now, HR is kind of at the bottom of the organization, maybe like 1 above compliance, but it's kind of really at the bottom. But we really need to elevate it to the degree of R&D. But there is a risk of over-regulating it, right? And the risk of over-regulating it is the Xi index. The risk of over-regulating is we'll give a one-size-fits-all. Say, how do you do human capital? You have to say thank you to the employees 3 times a week, and you have once a year to send a flower and what? No, it's not going to work like this. We need to understand that human motivation is incredibly complex, incredibly tricky. We do need to pay attention to it. We can't not, but we need to allow for flexibility and freedom for organization to invest in human capital in the work that works best for them. And the good news is that everybody gets to win. If we get to improve human capital across the US market by 2%, everybody wins. Employees get to be better off. Going to work when you have higher human capital is more pleasurable. It's good for the companies. It's good for the shareholder. Everybody wins. There's not that many opportunities where everybody wins. Human capital is one of those. So I hope we'll make real big steps in that direction. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really, really appreciate that you're here today. Sincerely.
By the way, when you give compliments, even if people
Inspires me.
think you're insincere, they still work.
Okay. Now I'd like to introduce Susan Ox, who will moderate our first panel using a range of incentives to build healthy cultures. Susan is an advisor to senior leaders and decision makers and the CEO of Ox Advisors. So with that, Susan.
Good morning. All right. Morning. Good morning, panel. So, how do we get people to do what we want? That is basically an incentive, right? That is the whole game of incentives. And we have a fantastic panel today, and I'm not just saying that to compliment you. They are actually brilliant academics here with us today who are going to help us try to parse through some of this and get into a little bit more detail. There was a terrific opening by Professor Ariely. So first we have Kathleen Voss, who is a distinguished McKnight University professor and Land O'Lakes chair in marketing at Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. Next is Mauricio Delgado, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University. And lastly is Mandy O'Neill, who's associate professor of management at George Mason University. Welcome to you all. Thanks again for being here. So we're going to start off with just getting some baselines on incentives. And I will say, for this discussion, within financial services, we talk a lot about financial incentives. And so for this conversation, we're going to actually shift and focus a little bit more on the non-financial side, because I think that doesn't quite get as much play. And as you heard from Professor Ariely, they can be incredibly powerful. But so let's start off actually with the science. And there's a lot of pseudoscience running around. I've never heard so many people talking about amygdalas before, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who've like christened themselves as sort of brain experts, but we have a real one here. Mauricio spends a lot of time looking at MRIs. So let's start with what is actually happening in the brain when we are getting incentives.
Well, thank you. So the brain is going to respond to various incentives, and it's going to use that information to try to learn what it likes, what we like, and to try to shape behaviors. And we have a set of brain regions, I mentioned one of them, but these set of brain regions comprise what's known as the brain's reward system. And this reward system is going to be active or involved anytime an incentive is presented. This could be something like food, if you're hungry, money, or importantly, praise or feedback from others. Mm-hmm. Now, irrespective of the type of the incentive, this reward system tends to activate for all these incentives at, of course, different levels.
And is it is it the same part of the brain that's lighting up for the food or the money or the praise?
They're similar. They're just going to activate at different levels because it's going to depend. If you're no longer hungry, for example, you're going to satiate, and that reward system is going to be slowed down. But of course, you don't satiate to money, so that's going to continue staying up for a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And we're going to use this information to we get some positive feelings from it, and then it tends to help reinforce our behaviors to look for further incentives and increase our motivation.
Right. And what happens when, we talked about the satiation, what happens when we get a couple of different incentives all at the same time? Do they sort of stack on top of each other, or does the most important one dominate?
So we think about the brain as computing these incentives and putting them all in a common scale where we're trying to figure out, well, what's more important for me right now? So we just heard a talk about, is it the incentive of money right now, or is it perhaps the recognition from a peer or an employee that's recognizing the work? And this is going to vary based on context and in the individual, but since we're putting them in a common scale, each individual is going to have different responses to different incentives, but all within the same kind of reward circuit.
Okay, so individuals are going to vary depending on how much you like pizza or the donut
Correct.
or the praise or whatever.
Correct.
Right, okay. And then what about the negatively framed incentives, which we might call kind of corrective action or punishment? What's happening there?
So we can get into the idea that we process incentives, but to approach behavior, this is going to cause approach behavior, but the negative information is also going to lead to more avoidance type of behaviors. And these tend to be processed in some of the same brain areas, but also others. You mentioned the amygdala, for example. So you're going to have responses to stimuli that predict something that's negative. Maybe it's a potential loss of money, or maybe it's potentially a loss of something else, or something that's going to be something that's going to cause you pain, sorrow, or upsetting. So the punishment can work in different ways to demotivate behavior at times. It might work short term to actually increase your performance, but over a long period of time, it's perhaps problematic. That's
Right.
why we rely more on the positive side of things.
Okay, and I want to ask you one more question before we move on.
Sure.
In terms of children versus adults, we heard Professor Ariely say, some of us, we're not completely dissimilar to children. How different are our brains developmentally in terms of the reward section for kids?
So that's
versus
a great
adults?
question. So in terms of children, so what happens to our reward system is it tends to be overactive in the beginning as we're growing up, as you might expect, because we are exploring new things and learning about new worlds, and this increases our approach behavior. And also what we have in our brains as we get older is a more of an emotional regulation kind of system or control system that tends to be able to say to you like, well, I would like another coffee, but not right now, right? And the adolescents don't have that just yet. And we can talk later on about context and how that's very important in then processing these incentives and whether you can put on the brakes and say, wow, I don't want to take that extra decision, or I don't want to take that extra risk.
Yeah, okay. The reason I bring this up is that a lot of people, when I talk to executives in the industry, a lot of people will make analogies to how they deal with their kids when they talk about how they're dealing with their employees. And I think sometimes we sort of over-index a little bit on how you deal with a 3-year-old having a meltdown at the grocery store versus how you deal with a difficult employee. So I think that understanding that the brain science is actually different too is sort of an important point in this. Okay, Mandy, let's start talking a little bit about some of the different kinds of incentives that are out there. We talked about financial versus non-financial, negative, positive. Let's talk through a little bit of maybe some of the ones people wouldn't necessarily even think of as incentives.
Well, this morning's talk was a great preparation for some of the, I would say, the latest work on incentives involving things around emotions and specifically appreciation, or what we refer to as gratitude. So I think Professor Ariely did a great job previewing the findings, which are that employees love to be appreciated. I mean, I would push back a little bit from working in organizations to say that people won't, appreciate the money. We're doing some research which says that, thanks is great, but pay me fairly, pay me, what I expect to be paid, pay me what my industry is paying. So I don't want to underrate that, but I will say that what we're finding, interestingly, is that if you have a reward without another reward that's expected in the industry, in the context, in the organization, it can have the opposite effect of making them actually quite angry. So you can say, the thanks is great, but pay me. I know you can pay me. Or I know that I entered this field knowing that I couldn't be paid in that way, but I expect appreciation. And if I don't get the appreciation, then I feel angry. Or, combinations thereof. So what's really interesting is that we've been thinking very simplistically about incentives, but if you think about it in terms of the range of, you hinted at the emotional experiences that people have in organizations, thinking about all the levers of culture, we're here for a conference on culture, that employees and managers have around emotions, then suddenly the range of incentives is quite broad indeed. So if you think about, do you want to make people feel inspired, or do you want to make them feel excited or enthusiastic? Maybe you want to think about your leaver somewhat differently than do you want to help them avoid feeling shame or guilt? And I know, for example, in regulatory agencies, and we'll talk about this, I think later today, but which emotions are we trying to get people to feel, and not just in the short term, because some of the effects that we see are quite short term, but others are quite long term, particularly when they're embedded in the culture. So I think thinking about that more broadly, and particularly the emotional side of things, opens up the range of incentives, punishments, however you want to frame it, really broadly and in an exciting way. And I think just thinking about something like gratitude or appreciation is a good way to start, because it so nicely aligns with kind of our organizational reward centers, which are around systems of rewards and recognition that we embed across organizations and industries. So sort of taking that, broadening it, and then thinking about it in the slightly longer term.
And does it have to be authentic? Because there are some people that, if you're programmed, okay, I have to show gratitude today at 12:30, like Professor Allier was saying, do we have to get people to really, do we have to up the EQ of the industry?
Yeah, and I think this is, science moves, progressively. And I think that when we were first realizing hey, appreciation matters, I think the logic was any appreciation better than no appreciation. I think as we're doing more and more research, we're finding anyway, my collaborators and I, that actually the authenticity and sincerity is really important. That employees can sniff that out without being trained. It's just something really intuitive, maybe even primal. I don't know if the brain centers sniff out authenticity, but employees sure do, because they'll give us feedback and they'll say, it's a dog and pony show. It's not authentic. It's not real. Now, does that mean you should do none of it? No, because I've heard employees say, you know what, I know that Thanksgiving memo or that CEO letter, is really, maybe it's not even written by that person, but it still feels good anyway. So you will hear that, but you will also hear people say, particularly again, when they start feeling other things like unfairness or anger or unsupported or particularly when it gets sort of a snowball effect, then they'll start to pile on and say, and by the way, it's not authentic, So I think, all else being equal, some appreciation, even if it's not the most sincere, or for example, caring and compassion. This is another set of emotions that really matters in terms of people feeling cared for, appreciated at a most basic level. We have done some research where people say, listen, I came into this organization, I wasn't really a very touchy-feely person, but over time, it's sort of, at first I was just acting, but over time I started to feel it, and even before I did, it still mattered. So I think if you really want to get your bang for your buck, if you will, appreciation and gratitude in the form of sincere, authentic expressions and feelings is the best, but you can't always do it. So if it's a trade-off between, putting your employees through the shredder, so to speak, or ignoring them if it means kind of controlling. I think about the range of what you're able to, knowing that the gold standard is the sincere, authentic expressions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Maurizio, you actually even mentioned when you talked about social rewards, you said even something as simple as a smile.
Indeed, so you can have a smile, a picture of a face, or just a simple thumbs up and a feedback. We find in our own studies that sometimes can be more motivating than even getting $1 in a particular trial or in a task.
Wow.
And participants really enjoy this idea of social recognition.
Okay, everybody.
Do you mind if I dovetail
Yes,
off
please.
a couple of things here? From a behavioral science standpoint, I just want to just add a couple of notes here that are really speaking to my fellow panelists. I did a large-scale review looking at different kinds of rewards and punishments across a range of human behaviors. And one thing, although as Maurizio notes, people will vary in how much they respond to a given incentive at a given time, but kind of some broad-based, broad brush strokes is that people will respond about twice as much to the loss of a monetary incentive as they will to the equivalent amount, one amount of a monetary gain. So in other words, you have to earn or win twice as much money to feel as good as you would feel bad losing half as much amount of money.
Share the title of the paper that you wrote.
Yeah, the title of the paper is called Bad is Stronger Than Good. It's a very straightforward name that tells you what we were going for. And what we did is we looked at performance and health and feedback and monetary effects. And the other thing that dovetails with what Mandy is saying is that on the interpersonal side, we find that that sort of 2-to-1 ratio that we saw in the financial realm is 5-to-1 in the interpersonal realm. Now, to be sure, the studies that came up with that are more in like the close, intimate partnership realm, so like marriages, for example. And none of these are like Newtonian physics. It's not like these are hard and fast laws, but it just tells you the magnitude of one, bad to good, and then the other, the sensitivity that we have to interpersonal comments, remarks, and relationships than we do in the financial sector.
So, okay, I want to just put a finer point on that even. So you could get 4 notes of praise and 1 note of criticism.
Something to that effect, right? So you need, again, this is coming from the marital sphere, but nevertheless, I mean, I think it applies more broadly to human relationships, and it's not like set in stone, but nevertheless, you need about 5 positive comments or remarks to offset 1 slight, 1 criticism, 1 cold shoulder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's talk in general about negative incentives versus positive incentives and how they impact us.
Yeah, okay, more so.
In terms of like long-term, short-term effects.
Yeah, I mean, the short-term effects, they're large. I mean, the negative incentives have a large effect in the short run, and they can continue to have effects in the long run, although people can sometimes behave in ways that are not what the change maker wants to see. So when people have something negative happen to them, they get some negative feedback or they're criticized, they may shut down, they may defend against it, they may dismiss the comment or refute it. So it's not to say that you'll necessarily get the behavior that you want, but the psychological impact will be great. Now, our work and the work by many others would show that what you probably need are lots and lots and lots of doses of positivity to help sustain the behavior over the long run. So whether short-term or long-term, it doesn't, at least to my view, it doesn't break down quite as easily in terms of positive, negative, but it's more about the magnitude of the negative, and you need more frequent doses of positivity.
And Maurizio, you've seen some different effects too, right?
Well, so let's put it in the context of stress, which is an incentive and source of where you are in a context where there's a threat that you have to, let's say a deadline, you have to finish something by deadline. And this may work short term where people work hard and they will finish it. But as Kathleen just mentioned, this is a magnitude that can be intense. And while we can have short-term effects that are positive, over the long term, the more you keep doing this and the more you can process this, this will lead to more of a chronic type of stress situation, which tends to blunt this reward system, and incentives are just no longer regarded, and it increases the saliency of the more negative aspects of the punishment, which decreases performance overall.
And you said that the positive incentives can be longer lasting in the brain.
Well, again, as Kathleen said, I think the even short bursts of these positive rewards, even a little reward gives you these positive prediction errors are going to enhance this reward system and keep performance going.
And how would you, I want to just throw in a little bit of a curveball for you folks. One of the things that's been front of mind in this industry is the idea of clawbacks, which is taking money back from executives when there's been sort of wrongdoing or malfeasance that's been discovered, and you're taking compensation back from prior years. And it sounds like the Senate Banking Committee recently just came to an agreement, at least in name, around doing clawbacks for executives of failed banks looking back 2 years. In the context of thinking about negative versus positive reinforcement and short-term versus long-term kinds of mechanisms, how effective do you think that would be as a deterrent incentive versus the kind of justice part of it, which is obviously just recuperation side? Any thoughts?
We talked about fairness before. Do you want to jump on this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there, including something we haven't talked much about, which is role modeling and norms. And so, you know, we look to our leaders, not just our top leaders, but even, and sometimes more importantly, our immediate supervisors for cues as to what's the right way to behave and how's everybody else behaving. So I think, you know, this is kind of not directly answering your question, because I think we look to what's happening to our leaders and we sort of infer what might happen to us, you know, what we think about the organization and the industry based on what happens to them. And I think to the extent that there are even bigger sticks in addition to the carrots, because a lot of times they're focused, in some industries in particular, on the carrots. They say, listen, I didn't go here because I think I'm going to save the world. I went here because, I'm going to earn a lot of money, and then, maybe I'll do save the world later. But, so the carrots are very salient, at least in some industries and at some levels of your career. But I think to the extent that the sticks are more salient in people's mind, especially given, this fabulous paper, bad is stronger than good, which, tells it like it is, but that's what it is. I think the fact is, our systems of setting up incentives are not aligned with the powerful effects that we know happen with bad. So people don't really think the bad is that bad. So to the extent that we can make that bad and, what happens to you if you behave poorly more real and more likely to happen, and happen to more people, I think then suddenly it impacts the salience of that, and that's just simply sort of a perception thing. But again, it's also like people aren't just looking at themselves and their own behavior, they're looking at, people above them, people around them, and kind of paying attention to that as well. So we're not just islands, even despite the Zoom world that we're in. I mean, culture's happening over instant messaging, culture's happening in Twitter just as much as it's happening in the office hallways. So being aware of all of that and how some things, do go viral, especially the bad stuff, I think is really worth thinking about. So to the extent that we can align that more with what we're trying to achieve, I think, again, I'm not a regulator myself, but it seems like the basic psychology would support that. I don't know, my colleagues, what do you think?
I mean, although, yeah, I would add to that, though, the notion that if it's several years out, I mean, in my other life, I'm studying self-control and intertemporal choice, so we make a choice now, but the effects are sometime later. People have a hard time imagining the future, even when the future is not that far away, and so I guess I would say the time scale of a potential multi-year clawback, to me, makes it much more of an open question, as Mandy pointed out, to the extent that it's kept salient, and that it becomes more about sort of an understanding of the potential realities of that, but you're trying to bring that to the forefront on a more, like, not quite day-to-day basis, but on a more of an everyday basis, then that might be successful, but the long-termness of that,
It makes it a challenge.
it makes it a challenge.
Yeah.
That's right, that's
Yeah.
right.
Okay, Kathleen, we're just going to shift now to talk about sort of context. So we've given some baseline about incentives and how they kind of function. And now we're going up a degree of difficulty because now there's a lot of it depends. So let's start off with the context of this sector, financial services. You've done some really powerful work on the psychology of money. Tell us what you have found in your research.
So the research that I'm mostly here today to talk about is the research on the psychology of money. And as I was thinking about it on my way over here, it's like one thing I want to just convey, which is money is not just money. And so what do I mean by that? It's that the idea of money has all kinds of associations in the human mind, and the way that my lab has approached that is much like what Ariely talked about, have people systematically reminded of money, half of them, and then the other half of them not, and then we put some sort of opportunity or situation in front of them and see how they behave. And you can kind of summarize a lot of that work as money activates this motivation to get what you want. It has the effects of increasing performance, so that once we remind people of money, like I'll give you an example, they may fill out paperwork while sitting in front of a computer screen that shows pictures of currency, like hard cash, floating underwater. It's a screensaver that you can buy. Or in the other condition that is fish underwater. And so their heads are bent down and sort of out of their visual periphery, they're getting these reminders of money or they're not. And then we would allow them to work on a challenging task, and we want to see how long do they work on that. And so what you see is that when people have been reminded of money, their performance does increase, it goes up. So there's something about linking, like we think about the psychology of money is like you're a lot of times you receive money for strong performance, so that link exists in the human mind. But the flip of it is that we only use money with strangers. So one of the big effects that we're finding is that when people are reminded of money, it sort of shuts off this more interpersonal part of the human motivation system, which is about caring and sharing and kindness and empathy and compassion. So after people have been reminded of money, they're not so helpful to someone else who's asked for help or an opportunity affords them to be helpful. Ariely was saying that the janitor, for example, who might be able to offer help. So we sort of have these twinning effects that it makes you a strong agentic performer, but at a cost, if you will, to the interpersonal sphere of life.
And you've said even it can increase your desire to have physical distance from other people.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we did. We set up an opportunity so that people could arrange chairs so that they would, in advance of having a conversation with someone else, and after people had been reminded of money, they put more physical distance between themselves, between their chair and the chair of another person. And so there's, again, as an indicator to what's going on there in the human mind. And so we think of it as just sort of trying to get what you want out of the system, and we can talk later about how that might, have implications for potential ways to address some concerns. But that, in kind of a nutshell, is a little bit of the work that we've been doing.
And it sounds like it's a pretty light trigger. You don't have to be sitting there counting out cash, right? If you just have a screensaver sort of in your peripheral vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Yeah, we did it with the screensaver, although our participants were sitting there for like 10, 15 minutes, so it's hard to say. Although other labs around the world have used counting out cash as one of the manipulations, we call it, one of the ways to operationalize this. They'll have people put their hands in a big jar of cash, ostensibly to try to estimate how much is in there. Or in the other condition, they put their hand in a jar full of pieces of paper to try to estimate how many pieces of paper are in there. So it could be that as well too. Yet other work out of Stanford had people calculate their own hourly wage versus the hourly wage of the average American. So and in any case, so a variety of ways to do that. But I mean, the other thing is as a culture, as a society, as a world, like we're thinking about money a lot, and so to my mind, it follows that it might not be, it might be easily to kind of cue it up in the mind and then see its effects follow.
Which presents a problem for everyone in this industry because we literally cannot escape money if you're in the financial services industry, right? So what are some ways, even just as a top line, to think about maybe mitigating that effect a little bit?
Well, one thing that might be helpful is in research out of my lab and other labs, we find that when people can view us, so let's say the situation involves doing something that would benefit others. If you can view that as something that is a way for you to get what you want, so keeping with that theme, then people who have been reminded of money will cotton on to that. So if you don't think of like the pro-social situation as being like a cost to you, but rather as something that will, this sounds maybe very instrumental, but help you get ahead or help you be liked by somebody. If you can see a personal benefit in that for yourself, then it would, from our research, it would suggest that might be a way for then the kind of interpersonal or ethical or moral kinds of behaviors that might otherwise be impacted to kind of come in line then. And then some nascent work would show that sometimes people reminded of money will actually do those behaviors better than if they hadn't been reminded of money, because now they're seeing it as something that is in line with getting what they want. So how do you kind of personalize and make it part of a person's own incentive structure for why they would want to do something that's caring, sharing, kind, ethical, moral?
Okay. All right. So we're starting off already with an industry that's making things a little harder. Now, Maurizio, I want to go a level deeper into the context around individuals. And it's not just that it varies from one human being to another, but it varies by the situation that they're in, too.
That's right. So we talked a little bit about the idea that the brain has this representation of different incentives. And in our work and others, we have seen that representation is very susceptible to changes in context. And that could be as simple as changing when you receive that. So if you're satiated and you're receiving a reward, you may no longer get that reward. But it could also be as interesting as if you are experiencing that reward with somebody. So some of our best moments are when we're experiencing a trip or a moment with somebody else, right? And we have these, let's say, social memories or social experiences. So I'll give you one example from our lab. We have participants just play a game, for example, and they receive money for it. Back to the money. And as you might expect, when they're receiving money, they are getting this reward system activated, and they're engaged in the game and they really enjoy it. Well, we sometimes change the rules of the game a little bit, and we just say, well, you're playing the same game, but this time you're going to play with a friend that you brought to the experiment with you, or another person that you just met. So we have these different variations where you're playing the same game, you're receiving the same amount of money, same schedule of reinforcement, and the only thing that changes is the experience, that this time your friend is involved, or you're playing the computer, or somebody else. And the brain representation to the incentive changes even though, again, it's the same amount of money. And the reason is because just playing with a friend, for example, just increases the entire saliency of the experience. People enjoy it more, they like to perform it more, they want to play it again, and they want to keep playing it. And it's not no longer just about the money, it's about the whole experience. And this is reflected in these brain signals and certainly impacts then future decisions.
And so there are we talked about stress a little bit. You also mentioned that kind of control and a sense of agency can also impact how you're receiving an incentive.
Yes, so agency is something that we don't realize is something that we want. We want to be in control. We have this idea of the strong belief that if we can impact an outcome, impact a behavior, then we can lead to the success. And feeling in control is something that we maybe do often, such as maybe choosing your seat in the airline when you're picking a flight to come over here, right? And people choose to sometimes even, they're willing to trade incentives to maintain control in a situation. So in the lab, we can see that if people will choose to be in control, they will choose to maintain control when they think that they can affect the outcome and affect that incentive. And this also tends to recruit these reward systems. Not about the incentive itself, but just about feeling in control. So this is another way to also, by the way, boost that intrinsic motivation, because if people feel like, hey, I did something to get to this stage, to get to this aspect of the situation, and you can recognize that, then that reinforces the ability to do it again and to continue to do it.
And just to go back on stress for 1 minute, you had mentioned before that stress can increase your risk aversion. Is that right?
So stress is also context dependent. So some of the work that we have done has shown that when folks are stressed, and by stress I mean we do an acute stress in the lab where essentially they either have to give a speech or they put their hands in cold water. This leads to an increase in lab procedures, and this leads to increases in cortisol and your participants feeling stressed out. And then they do certain decision-making tasks. If they're framed, if the decisions are more towards being risky, for some people who tend to be more risk sensitive and risk averse, they're going to be more risk averse. If they tend to be more risk seeking, they tend to be more risk seeking. So it's actually attenuating their more habitual kind of what they usually tend to do.
So it's exacerbating your normal tendencies.
Correct.
Okay, so it's kind of can't even predict that one. So Mandy, when we start to think about the context of an organization itself and its culture and the systems that they set up, I mean, just based on kind of what we've been talking about, should we be trying to restructure context as much as the systems themselves?
Yes, absolutely. And so we sometimes talk about culture. There are lots of metaphors. Many of you have seen the iceberg metaphor, but there's also the toolbox metaphor. One thing that's nice about that is you think about it as a box full of tools that you can bring out. Another metaphor is levers of culture. So the great thing about culture and about the HR systems and all the systems that support and cultivate culture is there are many options in there. So in general, we want to move toward having multiple tools in our toolbox, not just one. Money might be one, but as we are seeing here, there's a lot of complications even to the money thing. But there are other levers and tools we can use as well. And one of the things that came up in our discussion that is important to think about is that in organizations, we are not just individuals, that we also have to work in teams, we also have to work in divisions, departments, interagency collaborations. So how can we start people thinking about the collective and not just the individual? And this is where I think some other less explored levers and tools come in, one of which is, prepare yourself here. I come from Washington, D.C., so a defense contractor, once told me, like, you're kidding, right? No, I'm not kidding. AWE, A-W-E. So there's this, AWE has been around for centuries, but in the past couple of decades, we're seeing more research on it, not so much in organizations, but this is why it's so cutting edge, which is that, for example, I come from Washington, D.C., so when I ask people to describe, talk about a time when you feel awe in your organizations, they talk about things like when I walk down Embassy Row and I see a vast amount of inter-country collaboration going on, it makes me feel awe. Or if they work for a federal agency and they say, when I think about the scope of what my agency is trying to do, I feel awe. So this is somebody from Federal Emergency Management, but I think the same goes for the federal regulators. It's like when I think about what we're trying to do here, what our mission is, I feel awe. And then they say things like, when I'm trying to woo away a top scientist from going to an investment bank or at the tech industry and come work for the government, I tell them about our mission and they feel awe, and that we can't pay as much as they can, we don't have the money, but we can elicit something in them that makes them feel, not just motivated for oneself, but for the broader mission of the organization. And I know I trained on the West Coast, so I get this, it's a little woo-woo thing, but it works. It's really powerful and exciting. And so, how do we as organizations in our cultures get people thinking not just about how can I work harder for me and maybe even for my family, but also for my team, particularly in organizations where teamwork is so important, because you will not get people to work in teams if you are motivating them completely individually. And so I hear this a lot, like people, take a look, you don't have to do it right now, but the badges at your organizations and agencies, and it'll say things like excellence and integrity, teamwork, but then you look at the incentive structures and the reward systems, and it's all about individuals. So even just having things aligned, like it's neither good nor bad. I mean, some lead to more good and bad, but just be clear that you have all these levers, you have all these levels, make sure they're aligned, and that people know what they are, understand them, and feel motivated, because not everybody, we talked about this a little bit, is motivated by the same thing. So I think the managers, the sort of supervisors who are most successful are able to look at people as human beings with different needs and different wants and interests, and frankly at different points in their careers, because early on they might be like, yes, high risk, high reward's the way to go, because I'm not paying a mortgage yet and retiring next year. But then you think about over the course of people's careers and say, well, someone at this point in the career might be interested and motivated by different things than someone at that point. So how, as organizations with all the tools in our toolbox, can we help set up a system where people are motivated by things not just as individuals, but the larger mission, the agency, what we're trying to do here, and that inspires them, and that all the levers are aligned, to really have that conversation. And I will say, we made a joke about like HR is just one step above compliance, but really we need to think about it not just as an HR or a compliance problem, but as all of the organization's problem, including, for example, there are going to be our colleagues, frankly, I won't do a show of hands, but maybe a huge percentage of the room says, if it doesn't have a dollar sign in front of it, I don't care, I'm not worried about it, my boss is not going to be interested in it. Maybe we should think about that and then work backwards and say, okay, if that's what is moving the needle, whether it's number of prosecutions, whether it's dollars saved, whatever it is, like then take a step back and think about the systems that we're sort of bringing up and throughout the day we'll be talking about to help move those needles. If that's what the accounting department, the finance department, whatever needs, how can we align that with what we know about human psychology and motivation to sort of help those numbers? And if you need to show that impact, and you can. I think a lot of us that work in this field are showing that you can have that impact. But to the point earlier, science takes work. Science takes a long time. Science takes collaboration with industries so that we can actually show that it works in this context and that context, and that we can do it systematically. It does require a lot of. You started our panel out like everybody's an amygdala expert now. No, there's some of us that spend our time behind the computers and in the labs, like trying to do this work. So, but it takes those collaborations. So, I think context helps us.
So, okay, so the idea of awe and sort of a meta level inspiration can be really powerful incentive. But we talked a lot about how people are different and they differ in different contexts. So short of strapping everybody into an MRI as part of their onboarding process to understand their different motivations, how do we, from an organizational standpoint, how do we think about creating systems that help tease out some of those individual preferences to actually avail ourselves of the toolbox you talked about?
I mean, I think, surveys are annoying and they flood our inbox, but people will tell you a lot of things if you ask them. I do find personally that you can have a short survey, but the survey is only as good as what you put on the survey. Even the open-ended text box, if you ask employees and you have the time to sort through their comments, it's really helpful. And then just to talk to them. Frankly, people will tell you, I have a lot of people say, come back on the night shift, they'll tell you everything. But it's not just the night shift. People will talk, they like to talk. It sort of feels therapeutic to talk. So even if you think about the different ways we have to get employees to give us feedback, there are many. And I think using a wide range of them, not just the simplest 5-point survey. Sometimes you have to do it, especially if you've got a 10,000 person organization, but think about what you want on the survey by talking to people, because they'll tell you things you might not have even thought to put on your survey. Like, for example, I did one study where I'm not a work family, scholar, work family research, but the employees were saying, you know what really matters and what really stresses me out and what really impacts my life is the work family conflict I feel. So if we could help solve that problem, and it's like, oh, okay, so we really need to put that in what we're trying to do here, because that's what the staff is saying is a big deal to them. Maybe we don't think it's a big deal because we didn't know. So kind of ask them, they'll tell you. That's my experience. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think I don't have much more to add to that. Yeah.
So one of the other things you'd mentioned before was the idea of delegating control down in the organization around management of incentives. We talked about that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that idea?
It's kind of interesting. When we're talking here today, some of the stuff is really like cutting edge and, stay tuned until the publications come out. Other stuff we've known about for a really long time. So like the importance of autonomy and feedback and task significance, these are pretty basic things. So, not just like sort of just as not to be a micromanager, but also to be able to personalize it. It's really helpful because, this is where I see gratitude programs failing most recently is when the organization's like, this is great, let's do this. But it's at the highest level and it's a very blunt force instrument. Whereas if you say, okay, we want to do this at a more abstract level, but how do we bring it down to the levels? Then you can get, for example, managers saying, well, listen, I know Mandy, I like pizza a lot. My reward center goes off with pizza, so, but this other person, they would really love a vacation. And yet this other person, they just want the cash. So to give managers discretion both helps in the management job if you can to say, listen, here are the things you can use. Like you've got a pot of money, you can spend it however you want. Both helps with the manager's autonomy, but also to be able to personalize a little bit while still being consistent with, I think, what organizations are trying to do. I think where it gets out of hand is when you have one division that's like the happy group and one division that's like the unhappy group, and that happens sometimes, but one of the reasons they're unhappy is because they're dealing with all the, really annoying clients, and other people are dealing with like the, awesome feel-good clients. So, to be able to give some autonomy and allow for some variation while still being consistent, I think is quite helpful indeed. But, nothing, it's sort of like I saw a parenting hack. I'm a parent and, it's true, it's not the same as kids, but they're similar. It's like, there is no hack. It's not easy. It's not simple. This is your life. It's like, it's not simple, but it's kind of, by embracing some of the complexity, I think you can get more rewards long-term, no pun intended, than just sort of thinking like it's an easy, quick fix. Like, new screensavers, like at the end of, it's just the screensaver. No, it's not that, but if you take the screensaver and you take the management training and you take all the things together, I think that's when you can have really, really powerful systems.
Okay, I'm going to move to audience Q&A. I've got tons more questions for you guys, but are there microphones maybe?
Just as we move to Q&A, I
Yes.
just wanted to note this morning that Gallup just came out with a new poll where they looked worldwide at the Great Resignation to see sort of like whether it was still happening, and then commonalities, and what did they find were the two big drivers. Number one, money, and number two, burnout. And we can understand burnout as feeling like a lack of appreciation or meaning in one's job. So I think it's very much, still a contemporary issue, as Mandy was saying, and you can see it even in the news today.
Okay, do we have questions? Oh, super.
Question for Mandy about surveys, which you just mentioned. People like to talk. Do you find that there's like a predictable segment of the workforce that would put comments in open text boxes and maybe aren't reflective of the workforce as a whole, whereas a lot of other types of employees might not be so forthcoming on a survey or in comments?
100%. Unfortunately, there are, and we've all done this work, like excellent tools and experts whose entire job is figuring out how to design good surveys, how to get representative samples, how to protect people's privacy and anonymity, confidentiality, whatever, because people have all sorts of fears about giving their honest feedback. Some people are like, I don't care, I'm gonna go down with my comments, I'll live by them. But are they just the one person that feels that way, or is it representative? We have lots of tools, I can safely say, to sort that out. Because yeah, you don't wanna, you send a survey out and only the unhappy people are replying to it. because the happy people are busy working, they don't have time to fill out the survey, but to get a representative sample and to get one that gets comments that are not just one-off comments. And this is also why qualitative researchers in particular have very rigorous standards for figuring out, is this a theme that is meaningful, that is representative, that captures what we're trying to get at, and isn't just some one-off comment. So it's a valid concern, and I think particularly where there isn't so much attention to the process and the procedure, then you get these results and you may never know. Like, why is our response rate 2%? Well, because people don't really believe that it's confidential, or they believe that if they put their true feelings, they will be fired, versus, sometimes it takes something as simple as, really believing that an outsider is dealing with it. And I would say, a push for the academics, like not just a company whose job it is to sort of get their own baseline data and charge you per correlation table or whatever, but to really, feel like the data are safe and protected, and you're not just being used to be punished by giving your feedback, but to actually improve things. Nothing kills motivation, the psychological equivalent of the shredder, than people filling out surveys and nothing happens. Then you get burnout, you get cynicism, you get all these sort of unintended consequences of feeling like, I took my time, I filled out this survey, it's the same thing every year, nothing happens. So to be able to really say, listen, we heard what you said, and here's what we're doing about it. We can't do this, we'd all love to have yachts and stuff like that, but we can't. But we can do this. And again, even just to feel acknowledged, we heard you. This is what we heard. We're working on it, or we can't work on it. So lots of good tools. And again, even just, not just surveys, but sort of making people feel a part of the process, like by doing some of the experimentation that we do in the labs can also be done in companies safely, responsibly. And those are some of the most innovative companies, the ones who will sometimes put their name behind it and say, we were a part of this. We wanted to be better. We wanted to have a better culture. We learned from it. Here's what we found. So I think there's lots of tools.
That's great. Thank you. Are there other questions? Oh, there we go.
Hi, really appreciate you being here to give these thoughts. A lot of what's been said thus far has been focused on how to get employees to do what a company wants done. There's other research or additional research that suggests that people, as you've been saying, are really motivated by intrinsic things, and that maybe companies should focus on creating value and helping their employees to see that the company is creating value. So another way of asking this question is, in a sense, does it matter what a company does? If a company, let's pick on tobacco, if a company is making tobacco, which leads to addictions, could you use all these same tools? Whereas if somebody is creating drugs to save lives, does it look any different based on what the company does? And should companies focus maybe more on creating value rather than just getting employees to do what they want them to do?
Kathleen, can I?
I think I understand the question to be something to the effect of how much should companies try to talk about their mission or their values or creating value, I guess was the question. I think we know that, money does drive behavior. It's an incentive, it's a reward, there's a reason that we use it, but meaning does too. And the meaning of one's work really matters a lot. I wrote a paper called The Difference Between a Meaningful and Happy Life, in which we looked at what are the qualities, and this is a sort of about the work sphere, but more like about everyday experiences. And what we found there is that the things where people really saw themselves as part of a daily activity or an organization, that's really where they found the most meaning from it. And so I don't know if it's about creating value per se, but if you can get employees to feel that, and this is probably dovetails with some of what Mandy's saying, feel that they are part of things, that they see themselves, their values being aligned with the company's values, the company's mission, or perhaps even that they have a role in articulating what that mission and those values look like. That can probably go a long ways to increasing the meaningfulness of people's job. And we know from research, not my own, but I shouldn't state this quite as plainly as this, but like to some extent, the more meaningful a job is, then sometimes the monetary rewards aren't quite as salient of a driver. So they're both kind of independent contributors to people's overall impressions of a job, and can maybe play off each other in a little bit.
If I can add to this, that just to support this, that if you actually look into the brain for this type of question, and you look at comparing companies, as you pointed out, right? So if people are really supportive or find meaning in the company or in the mission that they're involved in, you are going to generally recruit this reward system a lot more and motivate performance in this experimental task that they're doing in the lab, at least.
So you're going to see the
You're gonna
reward
see
center light up more.
A lot more when people find meaning in aspects of the company or the mission or whatever it is that the task is that they're doing. And this is work from various different folks.
Yeah, great. I think there was one more question in the back over here. Do you want to stand up? Okay.
Thank you. Some really fascinating insights from the research that you've all shared. Some research that I've been involved in has suggested that in the banking sector, there tends to be more rewards for behaviours that lead to revenue, but there tends to be more penalties when it comes to motivating people to do compliance activities, for example. And so I'm just interested if you have any thoughts about what institutions or what firms could do to reward good behaviour or good compliance, rather than just rewarding pursuit of revenue and penalising poor behaviour.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think a lot of people sort of feel like, well, compliance is your job. You're supposed to be doing that. You don't get rewarded for doing the right thing. But how can we think about maybe creating some more positive frames around compliance? Which, by the way, in this building, compliance is like up here. It's not like,
Mandy?
Oh no, we stumped her. I'm thinking through, I'm still on the tobacco company answer too, because I was like, I've had MBA students that work for tobacco companies, and we've had this conversation about how do you, the Nobel Prize in economics some time ago was about framing effects, and I think that we talked a little bit about it in terms of gains and losses, but I think that even just in terms of framing the organization, the mission, the role is really important. So you can frame the same job as, bureaucracy and, kind of catching people making mistakes, or you can frame it as upholding justice and, so I think that's really important, especially for roles, organizations, companies who may get a bad rap, and doesn't have to be that way. In other words, that's part of the narrative. That doesn't have to be the narrative. And I think, especially, my guess is that to your point, compliance is up here. It's because it's a shared value, and we talked a little bit about aligning values, and so this idea of, we call it the ASA model, attraction, selection, attrition. So we have values that we carry around our lives. We're attracted to organizations who properly signal their values. When we see a match, we're likely to get into and accepted in those organizations and more likely to thrive. So I think, sometimes we get a bad rap because values could mean homogeny and with diversity challenges, we don't want everybody looking the same, but we should probably be aligned on values in terms of, this is important to me, and this is important to my organization, it's a match. And really, but for that to happen, we need to be clear about our values and signal them. So I think finding that match and also framing our work that we do in the most possible way is helpful.
Okay, I'm getting the high sign from Jim. So we're going to wrap up. I think as a closing statement here, I think what we've heard a lot of is that this is nuanced and complex. Professor Ariely certainly said it too, right? There's kind of no magic silver bullet that's going to be, here's the one-size-fits-all sort of program. And the way that we think about experimenting inside companies. We have 3 wonderful academics here who would be delighted to, I'm going to volunteer you all, delighted to go in and do experiments inside your companies. But I think there's a lot of opportunity, right, to learn and experiment and kind of keep that learning mindset as we're figuring this stuff out together. Thank you, everyone.
Our second panel this morning is going to look at how other high-stakes sectors have changed mindsets around mistakes as a way to create cultures of learning. Moderating the discussion is Amina Elderfield. Amina is a managing director and global head of internal communications at Morgan Stanley. And with that, I'll hand it over to Amina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. I am honored. I'm in awe, actually, if we all listen to the last panel of our panelists today. And as you heard earlier, these are industries, I call it, ones that we admire for their ability to always get it right. And the reality is, when you don't get it right, something absolutely catastrophic can happen. And so today, it's really nice to be able to be inspired by industries and experts who embrace the notion of making a mistake, right? This, again, is not sort of, you don't necessarily think, wow, medicine, we want to hear about mistakes. And certainly in your industry, we don't necessarily want to hear about mistakes. But boy, we're going to spend some time today figuring out how that actually becomes a very meaningful part of the culture that you embrace. So with that, I want to introduce my panelists. So in the middle, we have Giselle Anton, Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at Washington University. At the end here, we have Kathleen Heppel-Masis, newly appointed Vice President, Nuclear Operations Oversight of the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. And my left-hand side is Dr. Michael Ivey, Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Yale New Haven Health. So welcome all three of you to our panel today. Welcome, please, welcome along. Contrary to, I call it what my mom and dad told me, you're perfect in every way possible. The reality is we're not perfect. And we see that when we work with teams that maybe everything doesn't always work according to plan. I would love to start with you, Michael, just in terms of, we heard earlier about a learning organization, and that really, I think, and certainly in our conversation, struck me that a lot of your passion about it started from a very personal moment of really what does that mean to me? How am I embracing it? I'd love for you to share that personal moment with all of us.
Sure, thanks, Amina. So a number of years, 20-some years ago now, I guess, time flies. I was a young trauma surgeon, really just out of fellowship. It was a nice Saturday afternoon, pretty relaxed, and I got a call from one of my residents. A young high school student had been playing soccer, and high school soccer is pretty, they go after it pretty hard. And he got kneed in the flank, on the left flank, and he'd been brought in by car to the ED, had been there for a couple of hours, and they finally got a CAT scan. And on the CAT scan, he had this enormous spleen. It was cracked completely in half. He was actively bleeding, and he had about 2 liters, or about 40% of his blood volume, free in his abdomen. Like, whoa! So, I got over to the ED very quickly, saw him, he dropped his blood pressure just briefly, we gave him fluid, got him upstairs as quickly as we can. It takes a lot of energy. Once you're down one track, and they're thinking he's not that sick, and I'm like, no, he's sick. We get him upstairs, we do all the stuff, I get him prepped and draped, I'm gowned and gloved, ready to go, and anesthesia says, wait, we don't have any blood in the room. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean you don't have any blood in the room? I'm like, we don't need typed in cross blood. We just need O negative blood. Like, it should be immediately available. And they're like, yeah, but the blood bank's like a 10-minute walk. And the guy's on his way, but he's not here yet. My hair's on fire at this point, right? Because I'm doing everything right on this kid. And his blood pressure's in the low 90s. So he's not dying in the moment, but like he's close. Like I know he's close. And I couldn't, if he dropped his pressure again, we would have opened him anyway. But I'm like, okay. I'm waiting. It seemed like it took forever, just forever. And then the blood finally gets there, and we open him up, and I get control. Because again, sometimes when you open an abdomen that's full of blood, it can be, chaotic. And they could bleed some more. We got control quickly, got his spleen out. He did fine. He didn't even need any blood. And he did great. But I came out of there and I was crazed. I'd done all the right things, and he could have died. And in addition to how badly that would have been for him and his family, like I'd have been crushed, really. Right? I mean, that's part of the investment that you have. Part of the motivation that comes out of healthcare is related to the fact, like we're really intrinsically motivated to save these people, right? And it would have been just beyond heartbreaking to have lost that. But I came out and I'm like, and it made the point in healthcare, you know, up until like, say, sometime in the late 90s, this was right around the time that things are transforming, and I like to think trauma and burns led the way. It was a blame thing. We blame people. You'd be shamed, like how you did this wrong, you did that. It was right around that time when we started to understand it was structural stuff. Right, this is a process issue. I mean, the blood shouldn't have been 10 minutes away. We should have had O-negative blood there. Like, how can that happen? And so, you know, it took like 8 months and a lot of committee work, but now there are refrigerators in the OR with O-negative blood and in the ED with O-negative blood. So it really informed me, you know, it changed my view on things. Like, you can make the world and the hospitals a lot safer by doing this kind of work, by just looking at it differently and looking at trying to change the systems and not just blame people. It was a very kind of eye-opening thing, and that kind of set me on this journey towards kind of looking at performance management and risk management in a different way.
In the moment, though, did you feel like you wanted to blame somebody?
Oh, I did.
Okay.
No,
I think part of it is the instinct
yeah.
to kind of, and so what helped you fight the instinct to blame?
Well, I didn't know who to blame, right? It wasn't Anastasia's fault, and it wasn't even the director of the blood bank's fault. And so, you're right. I did want to blame somebody, but I was like, it's just, you know, as I thought about, you know, just even in the moment, taking a step back, I'm like, I was just angry at the hospital, right, more than anything else. Like, how could you guys have let that happen? But it was not. Again, I think it was not really an individual blame thing so much as, you know, a system.
And then in that moment, take us through that example. So great. So we had, you know, kid ends up being well. He goes off to be a professional baseball player, professional soccer player. That person is Lionel Messi. No, that's a joke. But then you're back at the hospital. Where were the conversations that happened to kind of get to the point of, hey, there's something structural that's happening here that isn't working?
Right, so, I mean, I talked to the section chief, the department chair, and we reached out to the hospital administrators, the blood bank, and the blood bank said, we can't help it. But I was pretty motivated to not ever have to do that again. And so they gave me a committee, put one of the, you know, kind of vice presidents in charge of, you know, some kind of operations area, and, you know, Norm, and I convinced Norm to be on board with this, of the importance. And so, but it took, because again, you had to put the refrigerators and you got to check the temperature. I mean, there's a lot of process stuff that goes, unfortunately, into changing this. But yeah, I really tried to channel kind of the energy. And whenever I thought about the kid, like I still get fired up about it. It's been 25 years. I mean, you can imagine at the time, I was pretty fired up. So that kind of energy, they got it. They understood that this mattered to me, that this was not safe. And so it was just a matter of kind of continuing to have that conversation with the people who are leading it. Yeah.
Kathleen, what was your starting point in terms of realizing that the learning organization could be something, not just sort of a nice thing that we wrote on a piece of paper, but a very meaningful thing that really drove your day-to-day?
Well, thanks, Amina, for your question. So you pointed out that I work now in the nuclear industry, but prior to my working in the nuclear industry, I worked in aviation, in military aviation. And so when I started as a very young officer, a long time ago, one of the things that was fundamental to my learning about culture is something very, very simple. It's incredibly simple, in fact. So after a long winter in Canada, we would want to make sure that there would be no safety risk to all the entire fleet of aircrafts we would have on the base. And so the one little activity that we would take about half a day, is all the employees, all the staff on the military base, every single person from the base commander to the management team, to the engineers, to the air crew, to the janitors, we spoke about janitors earlier this morning, everyone was forming a long line and walking the tarmac hand in hand, picking up little garbage from the winter. we call that foreign objects, that could, if they found themselves into the engine of an aircraft, could create dramatic damages. So what that did is you had everyone in unison working towards a common goal, which was the safety goal, the safety value that we needed to have in terms of creating a culture, a vision, and everyone was there, the leadership as well as the staff. And what it did to me is I got to know people walking that line. I was young, I was new, and so you have a mentor suddenly beside you. So it created a sense of community, a sense of belonging, all lined up with everyone, including with the aircrew, because whenever something went wrong on a base and you heard the alarm, you thought, well, was that person that was beside me? Was it, who is this? So you were really embracing the value, the safety value in this instance, and I was creating a really strong culture. I did not know that culture as a noun existed. It was just something that we were experiencing. And then later on in my career, I found out it was culture that we were creating, but I had no clue. So that sense of belonging, believing in the value was fundamental.
Giselle, as you think about, we heard the panel earlier about sort of a little bit of the incentive, positive incentives, negative incentives, where blame, shame play into some of that. As we hear these stories, you sort of feel like, wow, there was something very powerful about taking something that could have been incredibly disastrous and catastrophic and turning it into a positive. I know a lot of your research focuses very much on kind of where blame kind of maybe needs to take a back seat to learning and really thinking about the learning culture more specifically. Let me open it up to you in terms of what some of your research has taught us.
Thank you. So I study the effect of moral emotions, guilt and shame, on whether people in organizations break or follow the rules. And I really love Dr. Ivy's example because it illustrated how you can have this really intense negative emotion, and it can certainly devolve into something really unproductive like blaming, but it can also be an opportunity for the group to come together and analyze what went wrong here and how can we do this differently. And part of my research separates what we would call guilt punishments from shame punishments. And a guilt punishment tends to be the default in organizations, so you call someone privately into a room and you have a one-on-one conversation with them about what they did that was wrong. And that can be beneficial because it can save that person from humiliation. A shame punishment is where that conversation actually happens in an open forum with other people in the organization. And while it can run the risk of that person feeling some embarrassment, it creates a possibility for the group to see that this isn't about one person who made a mistake, but it's that the entire group failed. This is the idea behind a shame culture, is that how did we as a group, why wasn't the person sitting next to them, why didn't they catch the mistake? What did the leader fail to do to properly prepare this person to perform in their role? And so it's taking a group accountability perspective on mistakes and thinking about how as a group can we, with a spirit of inquiry, learn from this mistake and be better into the future.
Are you seeing examples, like maybe in my head I sort of think it as curiosity spawning conversation versus critique? Are you seeing companies, organizations starting to embrace that kind of mindset?
For sure, yeah. So I've done quite a bit of inquiry into the armed forces because they've really systematized this. It's another industry where mistakes are very high stakes. You don't want a negligent discharge that could be life-ending for someone. And they have really routinized this practice. So they have simulations of war experiences, and then they'll have what's called an after-action review. And the entire group will sit down and sort of pick apart, what were we supposed to do? What was supposed to happen? What actually happened? What went well? And then where were there areas where we could have done things differently? And it's truly approached with a spirit of learning, of as a group, we want to get better. We want to not make these mistakes again in the future.
And in your mind, what has been sort of the hardest challenge in embracing that type of mindset?
I think there is this, when emotions are running high, when someone has made a mistake that feels so egregious, that feels like it could have had catastrophic outcomes, we want to point a finger at someone. Like we want the blame not to be ours. There are particular techniques that are used in the armed forces to minimize this, and one of them is anonymizing mistakes. So they don't actually use anyone's name when they have these conversations. The focus is on that this mistake was made, and it's our responsibility as a group to find a solution so it doesn't happen in the future. It's not that this individual is wrong. So it's separating mistakes from people and thinking with a group mindset. How, as a unity, can we resolve this or improve?
Kathleen, where do you see this taking place in your world?
Actually, so in the operational world that I'm now in, to your point, we now have every morning at 8:30 in the morning specifically, there's a call which is called a rapid learning morning call. And we discussed, so there's a person who's responsible to monitor this, and then events that may have taken place the day before are discussed and reported. They're also documented. And then there's a whole bunch of people that sign up on the call, and just to learn about what happened the day before, about in terms of an event, a mistake or something happened, and that's discussed very quickly. And that may lead to a root cause analysis, it may lead to a lesson learned, it may lead to more reporting, and there's also a significance attributed a level attributed to the significance of the event, whether it's somebody tripped or somebody injured themselves and went to the hospital, or they were a group. And so that happens every day. Every morning that happens. And when there's no event, the call ends like half a minute later. So it's very, very quick. And of course, now because it's a regulated industry, if the significance level it may mean that it has to be reported to a regulatory authority. Sure. It may also mean that it has to be publicly disclosed, because that's also requirements from the regulatory authority. And it may also mean that, depending again on the significance of the level, it may mean also a little visit to the regulatory authority in a public fora as well. So there's a lot of disclosure, and that's to build trust within the organization, but also with all the stakeholders. So that's something that is done. Now, when something happens, like a Fukushima accident that we saw, and I had the privilege of working with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, on the report, there was an accident somewhere is an accident everywhere when it comes to the nuclear context. So the world needed to learn, the public demanded learning as well. So we took the time to go take a deep dive of why things happen, what happened and why things happen, and really peel the onion and document all of that so the world could learn and the whole industry could improve. Now, I went from a very individual level to super international and organizational level, but I'd be happy to talk further about that. But lots of learnings from individuals, organization, and as well from a worldwide perspective.
Michael, from your standpoint, I love that we talked about, in any organization, it's connections that drive our sense of wanting to be together, our sense of purpose often, but certainly as leaders within an organization, because I think now you're seeing a bunch of leaders attempt to kind of lead groups of young or up and coming doctors. What makes the difference that you're seeing in terms of young residents sort of saying, hey, something happened here, or a question that I had, versus maybe I don't talk to someone? Are there sort of leadership traits, qualities, behaviors that you seeing are really, really affirmative of I can make a mistake and talk about it, or maybe I don't really talk about it so much?
That's a great question. So, I think, so let me start by saying there's been profound change, right? So when I was a resident, it was very much about blame and shame, morbidity, mortality. Surgeons have had conferences where they discuss errors for a century, but it was so much about blame in the past. Like people would I know residents would avoid presenting cases or admitting mistakes. And that culture has changed, I think in part because of events like the one I relayed, where most mistakes are, okay, somebody made a mistake, but it's because of the structural stuff that was in place that made that happen. And so I think there's been a real change, but what has, and morbidity and mortality conferences now are not recognizable almost because there's such an emphasis on finding the root causes. Like find out what's really to blame. What really happened? How can we prevent this as a group from ever happening again? One caveat I would throw in there. So there was a time, it relates back to the last session. There was a time we thought we had a great idea. We would send out safety survey questions, and then we would go out and meet with the units. We'd round on 2 units every week, and be the CEO, the COO, the chief medical officer, the chief nursing officer. We'd split up, and staff would tell us what was wrong. They would actually tell us, like, no, this is what you should do differently. And we actually got ahead of things, which is like the holy grail a little bit in this kind of world. And we thought we'd be able to be exported, and we were not really able to export it well, I think, because we all believed in psychological safety. Like, we didn't just espouse the value of psychological safety, like it was a belief. Like, we thought people needed to be safe, and we weren't going to fire them. We were going to try and identify the mistakes and get ahead of this. And that's still something that's a work in progress. And so staff can tell if they trust you or not. That's a fundamental thing. So you need to have leaders having those kind of conversations who actually believe in psychological safety and make staff feel like they're safe to talk about these things. I think that's the goal, I think.
And I guess taking that further, so if they're, not that we're naming and shaming and blaming, because we're not doing that.
Amen.
We learned that earlier,
Right.
We don't do that. But if you're seeing, are there sort of, senior doctors that maybe people don't trust as much, they don't feel as safe with expressing, hey, I had a question, maybe this didn't go wrong. What starts to happen there?
So
in an anonymous fashion.
Yeah. No, I think that we try to give people ways around it. So like, if they do not feel comfortable reporting something to a given individual, we have a lot of different routes and avenues where they can highlight different concerns. And honestly, nothing in the hospital happens in isolation.
Right.
It's not one person. It's, okay, so the surgery resident's not comfortable talking about it, but the nurses are, and they bring it up through their channel. And so it gets identified, generally speaking. And so we're able, and it goes to the safety committee, and and that's how we identify it. And we have normalized reporting everything that goes wrong. We're not where the nuclear power industry is. We're not where aviation is. We're probably still a decade or two behind in that, but we are a lot better than we were. We really do report things now much better than we did. I think, and we have channels now. We have committees. So.
Giselle, are you seeing nuances or differences either culturally or generationally? Because I think that now a lot of us are in workforces with 5 or 6 generations that could be insightful for some of our attendees to be aware of in terms of making mistakes. Are younger people more comfortable making mistakes, less comfortable making mistakes? How should managers kind of think about that?
I think that we're living more in a national culture where people feel that everything that they do could be subject to public exposure and ridicule. And so I think it's leaving people feeling very afraid about disclosing mistakes because there's a threat that someone might videotape this and it would end up on Twitter, or someone might tweet about it and it could be career ending. I think within organizations, it's important. I sort of earlier stressed the idea of having these open conversations. I think this is why anonymizing them is important. And I think also Dealing with them in-house is important as a way to demonstrate the organization has taken care of this problem, has addressed it adequately. I also just wanted to speak to the question that you asked, Dr. Ivey, about what leaders can do. I think leaders can actually model this themselves. So a very powerful strategy for leaders is to publicly acknowledge and take accountability when a mistake happens within their unit. And then they're demonstrating that you don't have to be afraid. And in fact, it's a very powerful thing to do, to say, I own this, I acknowledge it, and also these are the changes that we're going to make as a group moving forward to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Kathleen, in terms of practical, I think what I said at the onset is we're going to offer some level of practical tips. What would you want this group to do, embrace as new as they kind of leave the conference today, they're heading back to their offices? What is something that you've done, that you've seen in your world that could be applicable to those of us in financial services?
A couple of things. So first of all is the walking the floor, and when something happens, as I just mentioned earlier, being curious, being inquisitive, and leadership, like I'm finding myself, if you go and talk to the people about, what happened, having sort of the inquiry mindset, a positive inquiry mindset, goes a long, long way. And then people, as I've noticed, if you do that in a very gentle way, people will come back to you and say, oh, I've got something else to share with you. So that goes a long way. What I found is, in terms of a little practice, is having a shared space mindset. What do I mean by that? So if we were to ask an audience like this one, for someone to raise their hand and ask a question to one of us, maybe they'll be shy. However, if you ask them or you to turn to each other, and what questions would you raise, like to ask, to pair, and then I see two people here, and if they were to ask themselves, it forces the dialogue. And then suddenly you would hear lots of volume in the space, and everyone would be super engaged. Now, depending on how you pose your question, let's say if it's a safety question or a culture question, you may get something really powerful. And the other one as well that I've learned, again in the shared space mindset, and that was from my colleagues on the Fukushima report that I learned, is called a log-in, log-out. So when we start a meeting, especially in the virtual setting, it's really difficult to manage, I find. So you start with asking a question with one word, describe how you're feeling this morning. One word. It's really hard. But once you get the hang of it, suddenly, well, I'm feeling great. I'm here. I'm feeling. But I had an issue with my child this morning, and I'm perplexed right now. I'm not feeling the greatest. And suddenly, what it does is allow all of us in the room to feel for each other, and suddenly it creates again those bonds, that cohesion, and you're able to gauge the room, and that creates trust. And that trust is fundamental. Certainly in our world, in the safety, where safety is a priority, that's important. So I would say walk the floor, log in, log out, an emotional world that you're looking for, as well as doing little tricks about animation of a room in sharing questions and appreciative inquiry. That goes a long way.
I think of the panel earlier, I think it was Mandy who said, there's a care, compassion that sort of needs to reverberate throughout, and I call it, for too long, those skills were sort of seen as sort of soft skills, but in truth, it translates to real hard and clear outcomes. What are the warning signs? So let's say you're doing all of these things, you're doing all the techniques and tricks that you've all outlined. Are there things that kind of set off your spidey sense of something's still not right here? What are those things that kind of give you that little bit of that pit of the stomach feeling that you sort of say, I need to do a little bit more investigation here. I'm not sure everything's going necessarily according to plan. Because I think there's a difference between seeing something in a file, I got my surveys, I see I had the meeting, I have my daily meetings, I got my stand-ups, but I still kind of feel something's going on. What's that feeling that you have? And what propels you forward from there? I'm saying that because I don't get the sense that either of you are sort of rest easy and at the data everything's working well and it kind of goes to sleep. I still feel that there's a sort of a innate kind of gentle anxiety that still rests there.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, so like the other, like we have safety huddles every morning. You know, we get updated on what's going on. We give awards to people who, report, near misses and have great catches and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, wait, so that you have awards for near misses and great catches?
Yes.
Okay.
So we do that. I mean, so there's all that going on. But I think that when the anxiety comes in, when you go, for me at least, it's more about when I'm meeting with a group of people. And, again, I mean, you call this emotional intelligence or something, but it is that kind of thing. You sit down with a group of people and you have the very distinct feeling that people do not feel safe to talk about what happened. And you sit and you know that there's more to the story, and that's my spidey sense, I guess, is that you get that sense in the room, in the moment, like there's something else going on here.
The stiff back.
Yeah, and people are just quiet.
Right.
They don't look you in the eye. There are real tells, although normally I'm not specifically conscious of it and looking for it. It's more one of those things when you sit down with them, you know that there's something else to the story, and that's what drives my anxiety around this.
Kathleen?
That's a very good point. I know what you mean. The one thing that I've discovered is when we did the report on the IAEA, at the IAEA on the Fukushima report, and in hindsight, because we also, the idea with hindsight is there can be a bias, so we try to not have biases. But the one thing is that there had been a drifting culture. And also the assumption, again, we're going under the water here, the shared assumption that the robustness of the technology was the only thing that mattered. And the system's view of the interaction of human and organization and the technology had been somehow lost. And so that meant that the shared assumption by the whole country, in fact, was that technology was so robust that you did not need to prepare for any other planning. So the culture around it was based on that shared assumption, which had drifted in a big way from where it ought to have been. And so taking sense of a drifting culture is really difficult, but you can do this by doing lots of little tricks that we've discussed already, but also adding peer reviews. Or checking with other industries like we're doing today. So those practices help recalibrating if you've had a drifting culture to bring it back, as long as, of course, you pay attention to the assessment, the action plan, and you honor it.
Giselle, before I open it up for questions, as you are working with organizations, I'm sure some of those engagements go according to plan. They take your advice under advisement, they execute, and some you sort of feel like, I don't know if they're going to get there necessarily. Tell us what you see as the difference between sort of those two schools.
Yeah, and I'm grateful that you mentioned that, because these sort of, as I've talked about, these public conversations around mistakes can go terribly awry. I mean, it can really go in a very unproductive direction and can actually become very abusive. And I've spoken to people in organizations, certainly in the armed forces, who have PTSD years later because a leader, instead of facilitating this learning-focused public conversation, really made them feel like there was something wrong with them as a person. And that was why, and they did it in front of a group. And that approach is just so psychologically damaging, not only to that individual, but to anyone who's observed that.
Right.
And I think for some leaders, it's a power display. It's, oh, I'm in control. I've controlled the situation. Look, I fixed it. But in fact, it has an extremely negative outcome.
Should we open up for a little Q&A? I feel energized. That's my word.
Yeah. Sure.
I hope others feel energized and informed as well.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. My question is, mistakes or crises, they don't happen on a daily basis. I wonder, how do you think about integrating the risk management into the daily operation? Thank you.
So yeah, we actually no. So in our daily, again, every day the huddles, each of the hospitals and each of the units have a huddle every day. It's 15 minutes. It's not long, and they go through a number of different things. But safety and risk are always part of that every day. And when nothing goes wrong, fine. And they share, because the organization is pretty big, they share what happens. So you may be in New Haven, but if something happened in Greenwich, they'll share it at New Haven. They'll try to share these. There was a time we thought, oh, this happened here, it won't happen there. No, hospitals are all too much alike. If it can happen in one hospital, it can happen at another. So we totally try to incorporate what we're doing into kind of our daily operations, the safety issues. Because it turns out it affects all of us. Yeah.
Perhaps what I'll do it for a great answer on the and similar for the nuclear industry, but I thought I'd provide you another perspective from a regulatory authority perspective, where an operator comes for a license application or a renewal of an application. In the nuclear sector, in Canada at least, we have 14 safety control areas where there's a management aspects, there's the operations and the various programs, whether it's safety, whether it's fire, emergency, the robustness of the facilities. All those are assessed by staff, presented to the commission, but also the public is invited as well to participate, even funded in some instances to add value to the level of the discussions, to enlighten the commission to render the best decision as possible. The vicinities, the public nearby is also invited to share their views as well with the commission. So then the commission in those moments has no blind spots, has all the information it requires to make a very well-informed, risk-based decision. Because of course, there's benefits, but there's also risk. So what are the controls in place? So that's a mechanism overall that's quite efficient. In terms of getting that license to operate, and then of course you show your programs that you're able to sustain and maintain and implement.
Thank you.
Nice.
My question's for Dr. Ivey. We've all had significant disruptions to our way of life and business over the years. Just wondering, I know it's early days, applying what you're talking about to the pandemic and lessons learned out of that. What you're thinking about?
Yeah, that's unfortunately a great question. The pandemic's made things a lot harder for us. I mean, I think that if you were to take a step, I'm going to be really honest and vulnerable here, so bear with me for a second. But we've lost a lot of staff. And during the pandemic, we were understaffed. We were so again, New Haven's not far from New York. We were overwhelmed. Right? And we didn't have the staff that we needed, and we just didn't. And so I think that set back the efforts. I mean, and we still have staffing problems. And so I think there has been this kind of, it raised doubts in people's minds there for a while, particularly in 20. April of 20, that first wave, we were just, everyone's like, what happened? And a lot of people were tired. Other people, they own pizza restaurants. I mean, really, people have kind of decided to go into other things. And part of the culture is the people. And so when you lose a lot of those people who've been in those roles for a long time, it hurts you. So I think that we are actively trying to kind of build the culture back up to what it was like in the beginning of 2020. I don't think we fell too far, but I think we fell some because just because of the loss of people and the understaffing that we had for a while and the stress levels.
Sure.
It's just there's a lot of burnout, a lot of depression, a lot of PTSD right now. That's really what I talk about outside of this venue is that. And so we try to be supportive of staff, and we're trying to make things better. And I think, again, by and large, we're on track, but it was a real hit to us. There's no question.
I'm going to ask a slightly other way around in reframing it. So a lot of times we talk about mistakes, and we actually tend to make heroes, right, of all the people that fix mistakes. What do you do in organizations where, how do you reward where there is no mistake, like the risk mitigations worked and there was no drama? How do you approach that? Because that's something that I'm very curious, because we're always talking about the heroes who fixed something, but what about people who prevented things?
The mistake avoidance. Yeah.
Yeah. So we try, again, we reward people, you know, for reporting potential errors. You know, we call them near misses, you know, potential safety events. Again, we steal shamelessly from kind of the airline industry and nuclear power, but so reporting those events early on, those are the people that we give a lot of the great catches to. And we are constantly trying to push back. Like, you don't want real safety events, and really you don't even want near misses, right? So what that means is you really have to try to encourage people to report these potential events, you know, just a relatively minor mistake, and we really try to incentivize that by calling it out and celebrating the people who've brought that to our attention. I think that's a fair bit of the work, is trying to move it in that. That's how you get ahead of it. I mean, and you know, that's the goal, right? Get ahead of it. Hospitals are really complex, and so there's always room for progress. I don't know, right?
I would echo that as well. I think in the same way that it can be useful to the group to have a public conversation around a mistake, it's also useful to the group to publicly celebrate or acknowledge when a group has successfully avoided some form of error, and making a big public deal about that.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I love that.
Oh, hi, sorry. Just listening to that celebration piece, Michael, it reminds me of some work that we did in a financial services company a while back, where we looked at the main drivers from a research perspective for openness and transparency. And of course, psychological safety was high on the agenda, but so was the quality of the listening that was done when somebody raised something. And the third area that was key was that the follow-up, seeing action and resonance in what had happened. And I take the point that celebration as early as possible is a key thing, but then if the celebration is followed by nothing and nothing material happens, then there's almost a double demotivator. Someone's giving you a pat on the back for something that doesn't change, and then you just feel, why bother the next time? So I think this idea of follow-up and the quality of listening comes through strongly in financial services, particularly at the supervisory and line management level. And I wonder if you have any advice for us as an industry on how we could focus on improving those areas. Outside, I mean, I do get the celebration thing from a person in the street. You could easily see that can become platitudinous in some way. So in terms of sort of really grabbing that ability to catch things early, how would you advise us to go forward with this?
So that's a great question, I think, and so I'll try to answer it, and then as best I can. So yeah, we try to reward these things early, and but actually it harkens back to the last talk, right? If you survey people or you do all these things and there's no follow-up,
yeah, it's not real.
People completely lose interest. You have to, I actually kind of stress this to some of the people that I work with. Like, you have to make sure that you go back and say, hey, by the way, we changed this and it's better. In general, people find out about the change because it's some kind of process change. We changed the way they document this, or we changed this process. So generally they know, but not always. And like, we try to make the electronic medical record easier and safer to use, so we'll make a change. But people may not realize frequently that we made the change to make it safer or to make it better. And so there is a lot of effort that goes on, and arguably not enough. Like, we would be better at doing a better job communicating with our staff But that, I do think that's an important part of this, is communicating out, this is the change we made and this is why. And again, the other thing that harkens back to both the earlier sessions, like at that time too, recognizing the people who brought it forward. Like recognition matters a lot. Like people really, it is great to get that kind of attention throughout the organization. That there's real value in that, and so I think, we definitely don't over celebrate. So we should try to, kind of recognize, right?
We don't over celebrate.
Right? Yeah, I mean that's not a problem. So
that's not a problem. But I agree with you that for those who do bring out issues as well as and good practices, it's really important to highlight that whether it's problematic or good practice, it's important to highlight those things. Certainly in our business, we want to know what goes well, but we also want to know what's not going well. So having a mechanism in place to bring that out goes a long way. And that happened not long ago where we had an issue and it was brought out and we made a point of thanking the person to have signaled that to us. So that was very important.
It feels though, we keep going back to the previous panel. You set a very high bar for us. But it feel one of the themes that we heard there is that it actually isn't just one thing that you do. It's a collection of things that need to come together in some consistent frame that create the type of culture and create the type of behaviors that you want to inspire forward. I think we have time for one last question. I believe I see a question right up there.
Thanks very much. I guess I would direct this to Professor Antoine, but of course interested in what anyone would have to share. Bank regulators and supervisors across the globe in recent years have been placing a lot of emphasis on the topic of psychological safety, which you've all spoken about, with a view to encouraging the term of art as a speak-up culture for all the reasons that you've illustrated. At the same time, we're also seeing greater and greater emphasis placed on creating individual accountability for mishap, with a number of countries introducing individual accountability regimes to hold people personally accountable for failures. And I wonder, particularly given your work on guilt and shame, is there a tension in those two ambitions? One could clearly argue that if no one's accountable, that's not necessarily a good thing. But on the other hand, if we're looking to hold people very pointedly accountable, does that then depress the likelihood of that same group of individuals encouraging the speak-up culture that we seek? Is there a way to square that circle?
I think the emphasis, brilliant question. I think the emphasis of what I've understood in shame cultures is that it's not about individual accountability, but about group accountability. So my accountability is that I am accountable to my group, and I'm responsible for upholding the standards of the group. So that group accountability mentality means not only that I have to follow the rules, but also if someone else in my group, if I see someone about to make a mistake, I'm also accountable to my group to bring that up to the group. So it creates a space where we're all accountable for each other, and it's not just about the challenge with individual accountability is that it invites this attitude of like, this person is wrong, I need to call this person out, and they're at fault, as opposed to taking the view that there's more of a systemic issue. I also just wanted to follow up on the last question about change after a mistake. So part of the idea of guilt and shame punishments is that they are redemptive processes. And if there is no change following the redemptive process, then we would say that that was a failure. And so one of the actions that's used in the armed forces is something called corrective training. So if a mistake is made, the group will be engaged in some form of training activity that aims to rehabilitate. So what is it that, whatever was the source of the failure, we're going to give you some sort of set of activities that will help you learn from it so that it doesn't happen again.
I think you one last. You're good?
Sure. No, I wanted to add, if that's okay.
Please, one last.
Sure. So yesterday I was reviewing the regulatory document on safety culture assessment. And so in it, it has the value of safety in this case. Safety is a clear recognized value. And then the next thing is the accountability is clear. And so I mentioned earlier the systems view that has the human and organization and their interaction. So if you were to make a mistake, if I was to make a mistake as an individual, best that I report it, because perhaps my tools are not working well. Perhaps there's a process there that's not working well. So in order to learn, for everyone in the team to learn from my mistake, if it's my mistake, then it's best that I report it so the whole collectivity benefits from it and things are done safely and everyone gets to benefit the technology. So that's one thing that I thought I'd mention.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, Giselle, and Michael. Very, very informative. Thank you.
Great. Gentlemen. So for our next session, we're pleased to welcome U.S. Attorney Damian Williams. In addition to his role as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Mr. Williams serves as chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, a select group of U.S. attorneys who advise the AG on matters of policy, procedure, and management. Mr. Williams will be interviewed by Martin Bell, who's a partner at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett, and a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York himself. So welcome to you both.
All right. Morning, all, and welcome. I will add just a couple of seconds to that introduction to my friend and former boss, Damian Williams. He is somebody who, in addition to having starred at Harvard College and Yale Law School, spent the next number of chapters of his career distinguishing himself and collecting very useful connections to people. He clerked for then judge for the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, Merrick Garland, who, as it worked out, would be Attorney General while he held this office. He then clerked for Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens and met a number of other distinguished clerks, including, I think, President Biden's eventual White House counsel, who would usher him through the confirmation process. And then he worked at a firm, Paul Weiss, in New York City, where, equally conveniently, he met me, a slightly less distinguished associate. Eventually, we would find ourselves at the same place, at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Damian joined in 2011 and has been there ever since. In addition to being the first Black U.S. Attorney in that office's 230-some-odd-year history, Damian is, I think, the first U.S. Attorney in recent memory to have ascended to that office without having left the office for some other private sector or government stint beforehand. So Damian Williams, thanks so much for joining us. I recognize that we have a number of folks very high up in banks and other financial institutions here. I believe that stress is a very bad thing, and so I'll ask the obvious questions. Did you bring any subpoenas?
No subpoenas, but there are some search warrants that we're going to execute at the end. So leave your phones out. We'll grab them.
Excellent. Good, good. Seeing as there are no subpoenas, one could reasonably ask the question, Damian, why are you here? And I'll say that because we're here courtesy of the New York Fed's Governance and Culture Reform Initiative. And according to its online materials, which I'll read from right here, that initiative examines how formal organizational structures and underlying drivers of individual and group behaviors impact outcomes and financial firms. You are not a prosecutor, You're not an anthropologist, you are a prosecutor, you're not an anthropologist, you're not a psychologist, or a career economist at least. What does a prosecutor have to say about culture, so defined?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here at the Fed, and great to be with you, Martin. So you're right. I mean, I'm not an academic, but as a prosecutor, I think we are keen observers of culture, trends, the kind of basic, big, unanswerable questions. Why do humans behave the way that they do? What influences folks? Are people rational actors? Are they rational and irrational at the same time? The work that we do, especially in my office in the Southern District of New York, we're frequently investigating and prosecuting the most sophisticated financial crimes in the world. And as we do that work, some of it is what you, from your own experience, understand. You're trying to get to the bottom of an incredibly complex puzzle, but it's really difficult to engage in that work without asking some threshold questions. How did this happen in the first place, most particularly? What went wrong? Even if you don't have to prove up motive whenever you're trying to investigate and prosecute a financial fraud, for instance, you're often trying to figure out, why did the person do what they did? Or why did this group of people do what they did? Or could something have gone differently to stop it before it metastasized into something that is really catastrophic for the financial firm or for the economy writ large? So these are kind of big questions that we're often asking ourselves, and they all intersect with culture. And I'll say one more thing. I think when I hear culture, I mean, culture is a broad term. It sweeps very broadly. I think we talk more about ethics as something that is, I think, within the umbrella of culture, at least as I define it, but maybe kind of a narrower stream of it. But we think about ethical culture and ethics generally when thinking about misconduct and how misconduct ends up occurring. So that's a big focus of ours, even if we don't have the tools that academics have in order to really dig into it. It's a question that's often on our mind.
And so reflecting on your own time as a line assistant before you took the big chair, you worked on years of the office's most important and most complicated securities prosecutions. You also had roles in some political cases, some concerning the New York State legislature, which had its own culture. And I'm curious about what observations you made along the way in line with what you just described as culture. What things you observed about culture in situations where wrongdoing occurs? When you were speaking a moment ago, I thought about sentencing as another circumstance in which everyone writes into the judge to tell the judge what the right thing to do here is. And some of the judges, there's one in particular, one senior judge who actually verbalizes the thought fairly often, why is it that people do bad things? I know you don't have an answer to that one. I don't know that any of us do. Right. But I'm curious about what you observed over time in the milieus that you came to know as a line assistant.
So look, it's hard to generalize, but I can reflect on some of the things that I saw. One thing that kind of jumps out across the years of experience that I had investigating some of these cases is that very few people set out to commit crime, right? It's not like on people's bucket list typically, right? Love to ruin my life, devastate victims. I mean, people, there are rare cases where folks really are kind of predatory in nature and therefore do incredibly bad things, but one of the things that I saw frequently, especially when we're talking about, complicated crimes, market manipulation, public company accounting fraud, mismarking schemes, insider trading, things like that. There are other things at play sometimes that lead folks to commit a crime. Sometimes it could be social pressure, not necessarily on a peer level, although sometimes that happens too. But it can be the tone from the top. If you have, for instance, in, say, public company accounting fraud, if you have a CEO or a CFO who is really drilling the need to make numbers and relentless about that. Now, sometimes people can internalize that mandate less as a goal and more as a demand, and therefore, in their own minds, can justify doing all manner of things that are improper to end up meeting what they think as a demand. And it may start small. Right. And one of the things we frequently see, is, again, to stay with accounting fraud, for instance, or a mismarking scheme if it's a closely held company, like a private equity or hedge fund, and you're seeking to mark the books appropriately, someone may not want to show a down quarter, right, or have a down year, and therefore may do something on the margins just to make the numbers, and it's okay in their mind because they're gonna clean it up the next quarter and it'll be fine and no one will know. And then the next quarter something happens and they're down even more, and then it snowballs. So we see that things kind of start small and then they grow and they grow and they grow. And someone who may have had good intentions at the start, who may thought, you know what, I'm a smart person who's gonna work hard and do well and be successful, ends up bending the rules a little bit until the rules suddenly become obliterated.
Thinking they can control the situation.
Thinking they can control it, thinking it's all going to work out at the end. I mean, that's one of the most common things that we hear. I thought it would all work out in the end. And some people think that that's a defense, right? It's actually a confession. And so it's just, honestly, it's a way that people can rationalize their conduct. And another thing I'll say, I mean, I'm sure you saw this too, even at the end of the experience when things break bad in all the different ways, and there's been huge devastation, investors have lost a lot of money, there are tremendous numbers of victims, it is really difficult for a lot of these folks to still see themselves as lawbreakers, as criminals, right? Because in their mind, they had good intentions from the very beginning to the very end, and maybe thought if I had just a little bit more time, I could fix it all, right? It doesn't work out that way. So, again, this comes back to culture and human behavior and, what motivates people. Again, it's really difficult to find someone who sets out on a path in their career that they want to, commit a huge fraud. It just doesn't really happen that way.
We'll come back to the notion of what motivates potential wrongdoers in a moment. But I want to ask this one now because I fear that if I don't, it'll slide off the program, and I think it's important. You also now preside over a particular culture at the Southern District of New York. And I think that people who have really gotten any window into the office, either through the television series or books that sort of illuminate what the place is like, feel that at the very least, the Southern District regards itself as a very special place in this vein. Could you talk to me a little bit about, from your experience both being in and running that office, what do you see as the hallmarks of a culture that works? And are there aspects of even the Southern District's culture that you've wanted to change or to tweak or to help evolve since becoming U.S. Attorney?
Sure. So look, I think I'm very lucky to lead an office that has an incredible culture built into its DNA. I mean, you can pull aside any Southern District of New York alum, whether they've been in the office for they were in the office, a year ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, and ask them what it means to be an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of New York. And they, I guarantee you, will say some of the same things that I'm about to say. It's about doing the right thing, the right way, for the right reasons, period. It's about being apolitical and incorruptible, period. That we never take actions because we think that it will benefit us personally or that it will benefit a political party that you may belong to. Those considerations don't ever enter into the equation. It's literally about doing the right thing the right way for the right reasons, full stop. Now, that culture was not always that way, as you well know. I mean, the office was founded in 1789, so it goes back to antiquity. And for generations, the folks who worked in the office were hired because of political patronage. They were patronage jobs. They weren't hired because of merit. The U.S. attorneys who occupied the same seat that I occupy now weren't always upstanding individuals. One of my predecessors embezzled tens of thousands of dollars while in office and then fled to Europe to escape the law. I mean, he was the law, and he was trying to escape it. It makes no sense. So, but the culture in the Southern District changed generations ago. J. Edward Lombard was the U.S. attorney, then went on to become a judge on the Second Circuit, but he discovered that there were so many of the folks who worked in the office who weren't hired not because of merit, but because of their kind of connections and whatnot. And he cleaned house and then instituted the new system that we operate under and is really our guiding light. So our culture has been amazing. And one thing that I will say in terms of mistakes, for instance, which is a big part of conversations that I imagine are happening here.
Previous panel.
Exactly. We're constantly making mistakes. That's kind of built into the expectations when you walk in the door. I mean, when I interview people, when I interview folks who are applying to be AUSAs, I often ask them about mistakes that they've made, not because I want them to kind of embarrass themselves in front of me, but because I'm trying to figure out, are you someone who can make a mistake, learn from it, and bounce back? Are you someone who is adaptable? Do you have a learning mindset? Do you have a growth mindset? And if not, if you're stiff, sclerotic, if you can't possibly pivot off of a mistake and grow from it, then you're someone who shouldn't work in an office like ours. We don't have the infrastructure we're not like a law firm like yours where you can spend the amount of time with each associate and have a standard of perfection. Every email, for instance, I expect your associates make sure that every email that comes to you doesn't have a typo in it. I mean, that's the way that law firms operate. We have too much on our plate in the Southern District of New York. Our docket is too large. The investigations are too big for people to maintain a standard of perfection because, frankly, we're all humans. No one can be perfect, right? And so if we're going to throw people into the deep end and have them engage in this kind of difficult work that can move markets, for instance, we need them to be the kind of folks who can, move quickly, do it with the North Star that I was talking about before, and also, if they stumble, pick themselves back up, learn from it, and forge ahead. That's really important. That's part of our culture. Now, you also asked whether there are things that I wish I could change. Yes, one of the things that I realized, for years working in the Southern District of New York is that we are an amazing organization. I think we're the best law firm in all the world in terms of talent that's working in the building. But if you were to call up, McKinsey and Company and have them come do a study on our infrastructure and on the kind of the way that we operate, I think the output would be pretty scathing in various ways. And because the record of success that we've amassed over the years and the people who work there are so amazing, it's allowed us to kind of paper over things that really should have been dealt with some time ago. So there are aspects of the culture that I want to change, and I'll give you one example. For a long time, we never really embrace feedback. You could be, everyone gets hired and you're a star. You're a star because you got hired and you start out, and soon, within months probably, maybe even weeks, people are trying to figure out, is she good or is she not? Is she a star or is she not? Is he excelling or is he not? And sorting people. And this process of extreme judgment, effectively, internally, goes on behind the backs of the people who are being judged. And so you have folks who may come in and start to struggle and have trouble kind of adapting and learning and growing because lessons that are being withheld from them effectively because this conversation is happening behind their backs. And so I've been trying to reorient ourselves around a different model so that we can kind of bring those conversations to the surface and have people set up for success because they're actually hearing what they're doing well and what they're maybe struggling with. That's a culture shift, and that's a multi-year process, but it's important, again, for all the reasons that I said before.
So you mentioned mistakes earlier. Another one of the major themes of this conference has been incentives and what motivates behavior. And the Department of Justice has spent over, I'd say the past year or so, a considerable amount of time and ink addressing incentives and announcing some policy changes, some major, some tweaks, that are meant to sort of address the culture of corporations in particular subject to potential investigation and prosecution. Among these is something that I know that you, in your capacity as one of the leaders of a nationwide group of U.S. attorneys who think about these things, I know that you've spent a lot of time on this, and this is the voluntary disclosure policy that the Department of Justice just updated. Can you tell us, in sort of summary fashion, what that is and what the changes were, and what it is that you're looking to do as a department with respect to incentives through that program?
Sure. So, for a long time, the various U.S. attorneys' offices around the country never had a formal policy for what would happen if a company found an instance of misconduct, criminal conduct, effectively, and wanted to disclose it proactively to the Southern District of New York, for instance. And so you can imagine conversations happening, at the board level, for instance, if, maybe let's talk about the audit committee. Say someone brings a matter to the audit committee and it looks like there is an issue. There's an internal investigation that's done and it looks like there is a problem. Now, they may ask, do we disclose this, right? They have public disclosure obligations, but separately, do we disclose this to the Department of Justice for investigation? And before, if those questions were posed, a lawyer advising the audit committee wouldn't be able to say, well, this is what will happen if we disclose, right? This is what was going to happen next, or this is how we could be treated by the department if we disclose. And our thinking was that as a result of the lack of clarity, there were fewer instances of voluntary self-disclosure, and we wanted to get around that. So the policy gives transparency and predictability, and it also tries to incentivize corporations to bring the conduct forward to us as soon as possible, not hold back and wait for us to kind of catch them, but instead to bring it to us proactively and to make it a good business decision ultimately too. Because if the conduct is disclosed to us and it meets all the criteria, then we can agree to not prosecute the corporation, enter into a deferred prosecution agreement or a non-prosecution agreement, give substantial discounts off of various fines and penalties that may be otherwise levied. All the things that we think that could hopefully make it a good business decision for the company to disclose. So there is a number of built-in assumptions about whether a company can be motivated that way, right. Whether it could ever be a good business decision, and I get that. But the bet that we're making is that it's worth a try, because right now, in the before times before we had this policy, we would see things happen, enormous misconduct that we would uncover and prosecute. And wonder whether this was a thing that folks caught before, and if so, why we didn't hear about it. And then sometimes the company would come to us and they would have the best lawyers in town and they would argue that, they're prepared to cooperate with our investigation, and maybe they do. But the view, I thought, and others agreed, was quickly becoming that cooperation after the fact was, in a way, being viewed as like a get-out-of-jail-free card. And that's not true. And we wanted to incentivize folks to think a little differently.
And just to highlight the context in which all of this occurs, the items that you are asking corporations to adhere to as part of this policy, they're not laws, they're not legal requirements. You use the term business decision because these are decisions that corporations can reasonably make. How quickly do we come forward with a document? How quickly do we come forward and report? And the idea is that even though there is no clear liability, there's nothing that attaches to that says, if you don't come over, you are breaking a law, you want it to be a clear business decision to come in and be transparent from the beginning.
Right, right.
And that is, there's been a fair amount written about the policy over time. I think the metaphor, tired as it is sort of the carrot and the stick. And it's a particular carrot and stick system that takes place with respect to corporate criminal liability, like what's going to happen to the company. Which is interesting, if only because there are different, whether a company is prosecuted and there's a whole other set of factors that affects that, which of course you're familiar with, is something that can have very different consequences depending on the entity. I don't know if it's early enough for you to have any thoughts or feedback on this, but is this behavior that you think the prosecutor's toolbox is well suited to address? Just given the variety of actors out there who could respond to that guidance in very different ways.
Well, so our toolbox is limited. We are not regulators, and so I think the way that I view our toolbox is we have a couple of blunt instruments, none of which you want us pulling out. But whenever we do, I do think that it can motivate folks to behave in ways that are better for society overall. When we think about culture and the lack of trust that a lot of folks have in our markets, that imposes a cost on society overall. If you end up in a market disruption and folks can't trust where their money is held, that imposes a cost on society overall. So, and I could go on and on. It just is a long way of me saying that, even though our tools are blunt, I think we have a stake in the conversation because, look, by and large, we are ex post actors, right? We can only get involved when we see something that has gone wrong, but we have ex ante dreams because any prosecutor who is being thoughtful about the work that we do would love to see a world where there are fewer of these instances of misconduct happening in the first place, right? We don't want to play whack-a-mole. We don't want to just be in the game because it's exhilarating to investigate misconduct. That's not the work. The work really should be about bending behavior and incentivizing people to do the right thing so that there's less work for us to do and so that there are fewer victims, there are fewer people who are devastated, fewer people who have lost their life savings, and more people who have greater trust in our financial system. That's the win. That's what we're trying to get to. So yes, my toolbox is limited, but I have a stake in the game.
I have, not only because you are my friend, but because I have obligations to my clients. I've followed your commentary at a number of conferences very slowly, and very carefully rather, and one thing that you've said on a number of occasions is you've focused on the importance of having what you've called a platinum compliance culture and a platinum compliance office, as opposed to, I would imagine, one that simply does the job of preventing law breaking from happening here and there.
Right.
And I think that one might reasonably ask, why isn't a compliance culture that does just enough, that prevents law breaking, that lets you work aggressively as an innovative business person right up until the point of the line, but not cross it? Why do you want what I think comes with that platinum sort of branding, which is a far greater distance from the line,
right.
When it is expensive, when it limits what you can do as a business person or an innovator?
Yeah, well, look, I'm expensive too. I think that's one of the things that I want people to understand. If you are a company that has a totally passable, plausible, fine compliance program that is just policing the line, well, the reality is then when folks like the Southern District of New York get involved, it's well before you get to the line. There's that gray area where it's unclear whether misconduct has occurred, where we have to investigate often. And that process, the mere process of investigating individuals and an entity can be incredibly painful, right? It can cause disruption to the business. It can be anxiety producing. It can last, far too long in many instances. And so I would encourage people, and I do encourage people, don't play footsie with the line. Don't try to toe the line. Stay as far away as possible from the line so that folks like us don't have to get involved. We don't have to kick the tires. We don't have to look under every rock, right? That's a painful experience that people could avoid if they have the kind of compliance program in place and the kind of culture that incentivizes people to do the right thing the right way for the right reasons, right? Borrow a little bit from our motto for your business, and I think it would serve everybody really well.
Well, I am expensive in a slightly different way, and so the time has come for me to return to the demands of the billable hour. But I do want to say this, Damien, when you were nominated, I felt what I think a lot of our colleagues at the time felt, which is that setting aside the historic nature of the pick, you were, I think, uniquely suited to be thoughtful and searching about these types of issues and the other bigger issues that concern criminal justice, that concern interaction with regulators in what is on some level a shared set of goals, and the many other issues that come across your desk. As someone who simply lives here, I'm delighted to know that we're in good, thoughtful, and always alert hands with you in that chair. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hello. We have one small stage change, so I'll let them. Thank you. No problem. All right. Well, my name is Diane Dobeck, and I'm the head of supervision here at the New York Fed. As we near the end of today's conference, I want to thank you all for your participation and, most importantly, your commitments to building healthier cultures in the financial services industry. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our next and final panel, a leadership discussion featuring two of our most critical decision makers. John Williams is president and CEO of the New York Fed. In addition to being our fearless leader, he is the vice chair and permanent voting member of the FOMC. Michael Barr took office as the vice chair for supervision in July of just last year. He's been at the forefront of our supervisory response during the recent supervisory events. In addition to holding academic leadership roles, Vice Chair Barr previously served as Assistant Treasury Secretary for financial institutions from 2009 to 2010. Our moderator for today's discussion is Gillian Tett. Gillian is the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large in the US for the Financial Times. Please join me in welcoming President Williams, Vice Chair Barr, and Ms. Tett. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it is an enormous honor and pleasure to be here today because, as you've just heard, my day job is that I co-chair the editorial board of the FT. I've written for years about finance and looked at when finance has gone wrong and when it's gone right for many, many years. But before I became a journalist, I was actually trained as a cultural anthropologist. And before 2008, I used to say that I was basically an undercover anthropologist. I was sort of in the closet as an anthropologist because it was just a bit embarrassing to tell grown-up financial people that I had a PhD not in astrophysics, but in the study of human behavior and culture. Before 2008, that really didn't command a lot of respect. But the financial crisis showed everybody, even Alan Greenspan, that culture matters and models can't predict everything. And since then, I've written a lot about it, but the reason why I'm so delighted to be here today is that the central bankers have also, I would say, seen the light and realized that culture matters. And top of that list is the New York Fed, which has been holding a series of really fascinating workshops and seminars and research projects to look at what went wrong in the past with banking cultures, what can you do to improve them, and what does that mean both for central bankers, regulators, and bankers, and one might say journalists as well. So very, very interesting theme, which I've been tracking for many years, and I've been delighted to take part in some really interesting conversations. So can you tell us, President Williams, first of all, when you look at what you're trying to do today with the New York Fed, how is this work going, and has it actually made much difference yet?
Well, first of all, I think this is a long game, right? We really have to think not only about bringing the best thought leadership, the best thinking, the best understanding, as you said, and as you mentioned, it's inherently multidisciplinary. Bringing experts from across many different fields, helping inform how we think about culture affects the performance of entities, how it affects incentives, how it affects decision making, how it affects things such as misconduct, but also things that are more positive. So I think that one of the things we have achieved over the past 9 years, and we continue to do, is really bringing together that thought leadership, that understanding, both within the financial services industry, but much broader, together with the regulatory community here in the U.S. and around the world. So I think one goal that we've had is, you've already said that, is to get people to actually participate in these conversations, really understand the issues, bringing these different perspectives. What we've also seen, which I think is very important, is that in other parts of the world, we've seen different regulatory authorities really take this on and incorporate some of this thinking and some of these approaches into their practices, sometimes just as part of a supervisory approach or maybe as a supplement to that, but really understanding that culture truly is everything. When we think about the supervision of banks, we think about the safety and soundness of those banks. We think about the financial stability of the financial system, and you understand that culture is affecting every decision that's made. Culture is affecting the risks that are taken or the risks that are avoided. So I think we have made progress. This, again, like culture, this is not something that changes overnight. This is something that lasts for many, many years, and actually, importantly, lasts beyond the individuals who are participating, because I think it influences thinking of future generations as well.
Well, before I turn to Vice Governor Barr, I mean, when you look at New York, you have Wall Street, very dense cluster of big financial institutions, many of which have messed up in the past. Are you now telling them that they have to take culture seriously and actually implement a set of steps and processes for improving that? Or what are you actually doing in practical terms with them?
Well, I think I'll let Vice Chair Barr actually jump in. I think, really, to me, since culture is really at the heart of all of these issues that we're talking about. We're talking about, again, risk management. We're talking about or you actually have a culture that brings diverse and different perspectives into the discussions. Is the board of directors actively involved in overseeing the decisions and making sure the culture is supportive of that? We've seen a lot of examples where that has not happened and where that's gone wrong, and unfortunately those continue to happen. But we also know, and I'll just at this point maybe throw the mic over to you, is one of the things we learned from our conferences and our webinars, culture is not just about avoiding bad behavior. It's actually about incentivizing and supporting and fostering behavior that helps the organization or the firm be successful on a sustained basis, and really can help, if you will, the bottom line. So getting away maybe from thinking about just what are the things you don't do, but also think about what are the things that you do in order to support a very strong, vibrant culture and a successful organization that avoids some of these problems.
Right. Well, how far is this kind of work, which has been mostly done at the New York Fed, how far is that being populated across the wider federal structures? And does it influence what you're doing?
Well, let me just first say a thank you to you for moderating, and a thank you to John for organizing this conference, and also John's predecessors, because I think this is a terrific forum. I had a chance to participated in one of the early roundtables when there were just a couple dozen people around the table. So obviously there's a lot of interest in this field. I think that the topic that we're talking about, and John references, is absolutely central to what we do as supervisors of the financial system. We might not call it culture per se, but it's integrated into the work that we do. So just a couple examples and building on what John said. We have expectations, for example, that a firm have an effective challenge process for risk. Well, what does it mean to have an effective challenge process for risk? You need a culture that supports the ability of that function to actually have make a meaningful difference on the risk appetite and risk performance within the appetite of the firm. We expect that boards of directors are overseeing setting risk parameters for a firm, that boards of directors are overseeing management's adherence to that set of risk parameters, that firms are operating within their financial capacity, that is, they're taking on that risk within a set of liquidity and capital constraints, and within a set of managerial capacities to manage that risk. So those are all elements of, they're not the same as, but they're all elements of culture. They're all inputs to and outputs from culture. We expect that firms are going to behave not only in a way that's consistent with the law, but that's consistent with the ability to achieve their mission objectives. That is also a cultural phenomenon. So we don't, other jurisdictions sort of explicitly call out culture as a thing. We don't yet do that. But we are, in effect, supervising the culture of a bank through these measures.
Right, right. I mean, other jurisdictions include the British, who have taken a very specific approach to that. I'm going to come back to that later on, but I'm curious because you joined the Fed last summer when it seemed to many people as if banking supervision was almost becoming a bit boring. And then it suddenly wasn't. Mm-hmm. And we had this little thing called Silicon Valley Bank explode, or rather collapse, along with a number of other regional banks. More recently, we've had endless, mesmerizing, horrifying revelations about JP Morgan and its dealings with Epstein, and we have plenty of other things bubbling too. Why are these problems persisting so much, given that you both told me you've now embraced the joys of studying culture and trying to persuade the institutions that you supervise to do so too?
I think it's a super challenging question. You know, one of the things that we saw at Silicon Valley Bank, you can broadly think of as a set of cultural failings. So what do I mean by that? The kinds of things that supervisors saw included the bank had interest rate risk management problems. And one of, not the only, but one of the responses that the firm had to that interest rate risk problem was to change their model to make that interest rate risk seem less than it was. They had problems with liquidity risk. And again, not the only response, but one of the responses was to change the liquidity risk model to make it seem like that liquidity risk was lower. The bank had a set of hedges on its interest rate risks that the bank decided to take off in the summer of 2022 spring and summer, because the hedges were costing them short-term profitability, even though they were protecting them from medium and longer-term risk. The incentive compensation of the managers of the firm, as set by the board of directors, only included profitability measures. There was no, which is contrary to our guidance and supervision, they did not include measures of risk management. So these are all, in a sense, examples of cultural failing. They're, of course, also supervisory. They violated supervisory guidance. But they are examples of a firm that is not taking on board the importance of risk management as essential to its culture.
Right.
The senior officials said about their growth in response to supervisory concerns, well, risk management always lags growth. That is a cultural choice about the values, the norms that are going to govern behavior at the firm.
Right. And in the case, sorry.
I think this is a good time to make a point that's come up a lot in our various conferences is, Michael, you made a really important point. This is all culture, right?
Right.
I mean, and in a way, I think we've moved beyond, is this culture or is this compensation? Is this culture or is this incentives? I know economists love to talk about incentives. I think what we realize is they're always, the incentives, the compensation, the risk management, they're all part of the culture. And I think that's an important change, and maybe from what you were talking about 15 years ago, where they were seen as distinct issues, when we're clearly they're not, and that's what we're grappling with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I certainly commend you for having, embraced these issues. As a journalist, I'm paid to be cynical, but I am, certainly giving you, good marks for at least talking about this and trying to implement it in a more significant way. Just to stick with Silicon Valley Bank for a moment, and then I'm going to widen it out. We had a really interesting conversation earlier about the issue of psychological safety and accountability, and how you get groups of people to essentially surface problems and mistakes in group settings that don't just name and shame people and give them more PTSD, but actually enable them to fix problems and recognize that it's structural, not individual. So if you think about this in relation to Silicon Valley Bank, given that you did, author an enormous report on it, was the issue that everybody had drunk the Kool-Aid and were just being unbelievably dumb? Was it the issue that they were collectively also greedy, they would do anything to make sure they got the bonuses? Or was the issue that actually one or two people at the top were doing some very stupid things, and people at the bottom were too scared to actually blow the whistle, or they didn't actually have a culture which would enable people to actually blow the whistle? Or do you just don't know yet?
I think that's a super important question and a challenging question to answer with any definitiveness. I would say there's some evidence from the review that at least one person raised concerns about the risks that they were taking, and that that person was, ignored, pushed to the side. It happens to be the case that the senior leadership's view of their own risk-taking was well aligned with their short-term profit incentives. So, you can ask, is it, a genuine view that X, Y, or Z is the most probabilistic outcome in the future? Or is it driven by the short-term profit incentive, which is consistent with that probabilistic view? Obviously, it's very hard to untangle that. I'm not sure we need to, for purposes of understanding that the bank did not, in that case, have a culture in which, when there were challenges, those challenges could be effective. So I think it is. Anyway, that's how I'd characterize it.
So it's back to that, wonderful Upton Sinclair quote that it's very hard to get a man to understand if his job depends on not understanding.
Right.
Or if his bonus depends on not understanding, more specifically, in this context, or these days a woman to understand. But in that context, one of the themes that's come out of a lot of the discussions you've had in recent years is about how you actually get people in positions of authority to imagine scenarios which may not be in line with their profit incentives or with their lived experience. How do you get people to have a lot more imagination in terms of how they look at the future?
Well, I think, you think about it, again, I go back to it's avoiding bad things, but also thinking about what are opportunities or good things or good outcomes are. I think that one of the key things is to understand that we're in rapidly changing world. A lot of things opportunities are created. You need to be forward-looking, need to think outside the box, if you will, if you think planning strategy. I also think the boards, the board of directors plays a very important role of all this. We tend not to talk about them as much as I think we should. They do have an important role to make sure that senior management is actually not only doing their job every day, but also doing that kind of thinking and bringing that into the room. I do go back to the psychological safety issue that you really want to reward and to encourage and foster in every verb you can think of in your thesaurus around people who either not only challenge on a negative way, but challenge in a way of like, well, what happens if this happens and what do we do then?
Right. I agree, and I think that one of the things that we've been talking about at the Fed is the idea of encouraging what you can think of as kind of a reverse stress test. So instead of thinking of a stressful scenario and then seeing how it would play through on, say, the balance sheet of a firm, you look at a bank and you say, well, what would it take to break this institution? What are the different ways this institution could die? Or a piece of it, a significant piece of it. And so you're creating a scenario that says, like, what would need to be true if X? And then you can look at those underlying dynamics. You obviously can then use that as a tool for looking at ways that the firm itself might need to be more resilient. And you can use it as an exercise to help, to your point, free up the brain to think about things that are not inside the normal historical pattern. We're all taught to look at the way, the human brain is an amazing pattern recognition device, an incredible pattern recognition device. So we can look at an institution and say, or look at a set of phenomena in the world and say, well, we can imagine the following kind of pattern playing out. But we really have to work harder at the kinds of things where the patterns we haven't seen before. So, again, to go back to Silicon Valley Bank, a fast run prior to Silicon Valley Bank, you might say you'd get a modest outflow over a period of 10 days or 2 weeks that led you to worry more deeply about an institution. Or you think about Credit Suisse, which had its own set of issues. Credit Suisse essentially had a consistent, in effect, bank run in their wealth management unit for over many, 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 many months. Silicon Valley Bank lost $42 billion in an afternoon, and they were lined up to lose another $100 billion in deposits the next morning. So, several hours losing 85% of your deposit base. That's not a pattern people had seen before. And so I think beginning to help us as supervisors understand the ability to look around the corner. One of the things when I first got to the Fed in July, I started to go around to do town halls with virtual and physical, but mostly virtual, with supervisors. And I said, I really hope that you'll have 3 things that you keep in mind as a supervisor. One is you need to be agile, because the financial sector is changing all the time. 2 is you need to be tough. And that's hard to do when the economy is doing well and banks are making a lot of money. It's hard to push back. Being a supervisor is a very tough job, particularly in good economic times, to be able to push back forcefully against a bank. And the 3rd thing I said is don't be a jerk. Because the work that we have to do together is really hard, and we need to do it together. So I think those kinds of approaches, agility, toughness, but also collaboration, can help supervisors think in new ways about these kinds of problems and push on them.
Well, I think the concept of reverse stress test is extremely interesting because that's not what's been done in the past at all. It's been much more formulaic. You have a driving manual and you go forward to see if you're traveling at X speed, are you going to crash or not, kind of thing, rather than try and work out in advance what might possibly cause you to write off the car. I'm curious, does the Fed as a whole ever do a reverse stress test?
I'm sorry?
Does the Fed as a whole ever do a reverse stress test?
We're beginning to do that kind of thinking. I'd say we're pretty nascent in it. We're starting to look at different kinds of tools we could use in the supervisory process, and reverse stress testing is one of those tools. We have also, begun to look more at, at ourselves and think about our own culture as an institution. One of the things that not only our SVB report, but also the report in the global financial crisis and reports earlier than that found is that we tend to have a culture that makes it difficult for the institution to act quickly with respect to supervision. We try and build consensus. We want to make sure that our evidentiary record is strong. We're an institution that focuses on due process, which is a really important value. But we're not an institution that moves quickly on supervisory issues. We're great in a crisis at moving fast, but on supervisory issues as an institution, we work more slowly. So one of the things we're trying to think about is, are there ways to change that culture, to change the incentives for supervisory staff, and to enhance the tools available to supervisors to take those steps when they need to. So for example, putting in place, let's say you see a real governance issue at a bank, which governance is another word for culture. You see a real governance issue at a bank, instead of only having the firm work on that governance issue, let's also put in place a mitigant right away if the problem's serious enough, additional capital, for example, so that we're providing an incentive to the firm to act quickly on that issue, and we're putting in place a mitigant given that their risk culture is not up to snuff in the meanwhile.
Right. And just on that point quickly, before I come to John, have you done a sort of internal structural review of what went wrong with SVB along the lines of what we just heard in the last panel in relation to the Fed supervisory functions? Because, we just heard earlier, that doctors and nuclear scientists or, pilots, military pilots, in different guises get together at 8 o'clock every morning or whatever else and have a quick recap of what went wrong the day before, or similarly have these joint discussions, group discussions, trying to avoid naming and shaming or blaming individuals, but talking more about the structural processes that cause something to go wrong. And I'm curious, is that something that you've done at the Fed in relation to the Silicon Valley banking saga?
Yes, very.
Or John
very,
as well, maybe you've done that too, but I think probably Michael, sorry, you.
Yeah, no, very much. I mean, that's the first thing, the Monday morning after that terrible weekend, Chair Powell and I sat down together, and we both had the same idea over the weekend, which is we really need to do a searching review of what went wrong here. And so that's what we did. We had a very rigorous process that was led by Kevin Styro, who used to be the head of supervision here in New York, and a team of 20 or so individuals from around the Federal Reserve System. And we asked them to look at what went wrong with supervision at SVB. And they produced, I think, a really searching report. It's 114 pages they did in six weeks with just a killer team. And that report is really, as many people said, unflinching about where we went wrong and what we need to do to fix it. That report, together with other inputs, we had a work we've done on the future of supervision internally. We had a blue sky visioning process to bring in alternative ideas. And those three inputs are now leading to the next phase, which is over the next 6 months, we're going to do a project that looks system-wide at areas where we can enhance our supervisory culture, our practices, our behaviors, our tools, and also where we need to change regulation of the affected firms. And that's going to go in tandem over the next 6 months. So we're extremely focused on this question.
Right, that's fascinating. President Williams, I'm curious, we've talked a lot about Silicon Valley Bank and the lessons from that. There are other issues bubbling as well, like obviously the JP Morgan Epstein story. Are there any lessons you think that people could or should be learning from that at the moment about what's gone wrong, what could go right in the future?
I think it's many of the same actual lessons that we've just talked about, that around the importance of culture. And I guess I have one thing I would add to this. We talked about, the desire to have a consensus and move, cautiously or move carefully. But I think the other thing is there is a natural tendency on what's seen as qualitative issues, and you mentioned governance, we've talked about culture, to view those through a slightly different lens than quantitative issues. Like you think about capital, liquidity requirements, those are regularly reported, those stress tests, there's a lot of spreadsheets and an enormous amount of work in numbers, and what the number you need to hit. And I think we're still, as an organization, organizations around the world, still developing that comfort around the more qualitative aspects about governance, and culture and expectations for that. Now that's been changing over time. I'm not, we've seen that happen because a lot of the issues you run into with banks aren't necessarily the quantitative issues. They're more operational risk or risk management or things like that. So I think that when I think about some of these issues, we need to be nimble or agile and all those words also around things that are, maybe some people would call them fuzzier or harder to quantify. And I think it gets to exactly what Michael said, is if you have issues around governance issues or culture issues, and you see those, you should just assume that they're manifesting themselves in other places. We've seen this with other institutions in the past where it's rare that it's an idiosyncratic one problem at an institution, that if they're having this issue in this part of the bank, it's probably showing up in different ways. And I guess the going in assumption should be that correlation coefficient is close to 1, not close to 0. And I think that's, to me, one of the lessons that we've learned over the past 10 years or so.
I mean, I think that's exactly right, John. And if you ignore that, then you end up playing kind of whack-a-mole. Firm has a problem, they fix that particular problem, they have a next problem, they fix a problem, but the underlying problem is there's a root cause of all of that, and we ask them to do root cause analysis. And the reason we ask them to do that is precisely as John said, it's likely that if they have this kind of mess up in one area, they're going to mess up in another area. You want to get firms in a position to be able to have a strong risk management culture where they can do their own risk assessment and have it consistently produce the information they need to correct, and then actually to correct that set of problems. And once a bank has that kind of risk management culture, if they discover a problem at another part of the institution, they will have discovered it themselves, and they'll have a process for escalating that to the appropriate level, and then putting the resources required to fix that problem.
So a question for both of you. I mean, do you see much or any sign on the ground that after these shocking sagas around Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse, and the others, there's actually change happening right now inside banks? I mean, do you have any confidence that we're going to have, that you're going to have a slightly quieter summer?
Well,
that's different.
Let me just say it's my job to worry about things. And by disposition, I am not comfortable with really anything.
But in terms of your level of discomfort, is it higher or lower than it was 3 months ago?
So we've made a lot of progress in the banking system, and overall the system, I think, is quite sound. But it doesn't mean that there aren't issues that we have to pay attention to. There are, and we are. And obviously, many banks in the wake of the Silicon Valley Bank and then First Republic and Signature Bank failures went into a much more defensive position. So defensive in lots of ways, but building up their liquidity position so that they had strong liquidity in the event of any difficulty, as an example of that. And many banks in the country operate just fine. Most banks have a good risk management culture. Most banks operate within a set of risk parameters set by their board. Most banks have good interest rate and liquidity management. we are looking for risks where they arise, but I wouldn't want people to overgeneralize from these cases.
Right. Other things.
I have an example in my mind very much. Is it's late June, so I'm very focused on the end of LIBOR at the end of June.
Yes.
June. But one of the lessons to me from that was we clearly had bad actors. Going back to after the financial crisis or during the financial crisis around LIBOR, there was misconduct issues. So obviously those need to be addressed, and that gets to culture, it gets to the incentives, it gets to a lot of things. But when you think about it, we also had a structurally flawed financial, reference rate system with U.S. dollar LIBOR and other reference rates around the world. So there are two things. One is you have to address the behavior, the misconduct, and those issues. Those have to be addressed. But you also want to make sure that the foundation of our financial system is really strong and actually, not, I won't say immune, but far less kind of subject to those kind of issues. And, over the past, roughly 10 years, we've been getting off of LIBOR, moving on to a robust reference rate. So to me, there's a lesson in that too, is think about how do we build the foundations of a financial system where, not only culturally, but the ability or the incentive to misbehave also changes. So, we have 10 more days and counting. I do the countdown clock on LIBOR. But I do think it is a success. I mean, it's a sign that we can say, okay, we've seen these issues. We clearly, they undermine confidence in the financial system. Clearly, they were flawed, but with a lot of work and effort, we can actually resolve those issues. So I think that's another reminder of how we have made progress, besides capital liquidity, besides the things we talked about, also building a more sound foundation to our financial system that hopefully will also reduce some of these risks.
Do you think you need to change the kind of people who you hire as supervisors, or encourage banks to change the people that they hire as bankers? I mean, should there be more psychologists or anthropologists or sociologists on your staff?
You forgot economists.
And economists, yeah.
We have enough
I kind of
economists.
think you have plenty of economists. I don't think you're over-indexed already.
Right. John, let's stipulate that we have enough economists and lawyers.
Well, that leaves anthropologists, sociologists.
But I'm curious, do you think it's time to actually bring in behavioral science analysis from other disciplines, or put a few sort of medical doctors or aviation safety people on your staff?
No, you all are laughing, but no, she's serious, and I do think that there's. I think
that's called your revenge. Yes.
Yeah. Jillian was at a conference that I organized at Michigan a number of years ago, where we brought in people like the ones you heard this morning, scientists who were experts in the oil platform rigs safety and security, scientists who were expert in the tiles on the space shuttle and risks from that, or experts who look at nuclear safety, experts who look at the way in which disease is transmitted across society, epidemiologists. So I do think having that interdisciplinary frame is absolutely critical to getting outside, our own head. I don't mean that individually, I mean, structurally as part of the system. So I do think interdisciplinary approaches make a lot of sense. I would say, as an academic, putting my academic hat on, the most important work that I ever worked on as an academic, I did when I collaborated with a behavioral economist and a psychologist, looking at ways that regulation and economics and psychology come together to form a full picture of the way in which financial institutions ought to be regulated. I think having those interdisciplinary perspectives is really critical, and I would love to see us move to a system where we bring in much more of that interdisciplinary expertise to look at risk in the system. I think it would be really helpful.
And one thing we've seen is, especially with our webinars during the pandemic, when we switched from these in-person meetings to the webinars, we brought in a lot of these experts from around the world, whether from NASA, from aerospace, from health sciences and everything. But I think one of the things that we all should remind ourselves is we're not unique in these issues, whether it's culture, whether it's risk management, whether it's all the things that we talk about here. Everybody is dealing with them because they're all dealing with human beings.
Yes.
And they're all kind of subject to the same kind of biases, the same kind of group dynamics. And so I feel like, and I've been almost 29 years in the Fed now, that we tend to convince ourselves that the problems that we're facing and the things we're dealing with are really unique to us as an organization. I think the banks kind of probably feel the same way. It's very unique to financial services. But I do think these are much broader. We learn a lot from bringing the other people in the conversation. And I've noticed, at least in our webinars that I've participated in, that the people in financial services and the people in the regulatory community, I think it has been eye-opening to all of us, them and us, to see that. Like, well, it's, NASA deals with the same issues we do, and they've come up with some, very interesting ways to try to address them.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one of the unexpected benefits of Zoom culture, is bringing in different perspectives, but also different geographies. And I'm curious, we haven't got a lot of time left. I'm just curious, is there anything, I mean, Americans don't often look to the UK or Europe to learn things, but is there anything that you think you'd like to learn from the UK or Singapore or anywhere else?
We could read some really interesting columns by Gillian Tett.
Well, I'm based in New York, so.
Yeah, no, I do think there's a ton we can learn from other jurisdictions. And again, part of that is about getting outside our own heads. Even if the particular substance of what another jurisdiction is doing would not be a perfect fit with the way we would do things, you can learn a ton. The UK, as you mentioned, has been quite forward-looking in a couple ways that I think are worth looking at. One is on the way in which the UK looks at senior managers and holds them accountable. And a second is the way in which the UK applies what is known in the capital framework as Pillar 2 approaches, meaning firm-specific capital and liquidity buffers designed to manage for that firm's particular risk. Australia's been doing some quite interesting work with interdisciplinary teams. The Netherlands is very much at the forefront of looking at using behavioral insights to explicitly look at culture per se, and others as well. So I think there's a ton that we can learn from other jurisdictions. We included one sentence on this in the SVB report that apparently got a lot of play in the preparation for this conference about the need to learn from other jurisdictions in this space.
Right. You've got about a minute, President Williams, to tell us what you think about learning from the Brits.
Well, I was...
or not. Or the Australians, or the Dutch, or anyone else.
Or Ireland.
Or the Canadians.
And the Canadians as well, right. I think what we're seeing, again, over the past 9 years as we've been doing this work, is more jurisdictions, experimenting or doing pilots or developing programs. And I think that's a very healthy development, because that way we can actually see, how does this help? What are the benefits of this? Or how does this actually play out? We all can learn from each other. It's also breaking down, if you will, the silos between culture and supervision, because they really, as we've talked about, these are all the same things we're talking, we're really focused on. So I think from our point of view, we're from this conference point of view, I think it's trying to engage in a conversation, learn what's working, what isn't working, what can we import, even if we don't call it culture, we can import it into our thinking about this.
Right. Well, we are sadly out of time. It just remains for me to say a very big thank you to both of you. I think we'll all be watching with great interest what transpires in the next 3 to 6 months, and hoping that you do indeed have a quieter summer. And I'll just end by saying to both of you, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Ms. Tett for a great discussion. Thanks to all of our speakers today for sharing their insights and perspectives. And we're also grateful to everyone attending today, and hope you're taking away some valuable lessons that you can use in your own organizations. So with that, we will break for lunch. Thank you.